Love that gavel. We will get started this afternoon with Dr. Michael Wyde again on a presentation on the NTP studies in mice. Dr. Wyde.
All right. Good afternoon. Now that everybody's fed, let's dive into some of the actual data. So I'll be giving a summary of what you see in the report. What we're going to talk about today is the 28-day data and the 2-year data. This is a slide that I showed yesterday, but specifically today we'll just be talking about the mice. So we'll talk about the 28-day exposures in mice at 5, 10, and 15 watts per kilogram. And in the 2-year study, we'll be looking at the 14-week interim evaluation, at which point we did histopathology. We looked at gene tox, which Christine Witt gave a great talk about this morning, and hematology. And then we'll also look at the 2-year studies, the full 2-year studies. These were conducted at 2.5, 5, and 10 watts per kilogram. So just an overview. Basically, like I just said, we'll go through the 28-day, the 2-year studies for both the GSM and CDMA. We'll look at the gene tox and the pathology results, and then we'll go through the levels of evidence conclusion. So for the 28-day studies, there were 10 male and 10 female mice per power level, per specific absorption rate, and per modulation. These animals were 5 weeks old at the study initiation. As I just mentioned, the SAR exposures were range from 5 to 15 watts per kilogram for the 28-day studies. And the 15, as I mentioned yesterday, was based on some of the data that we received from the thermal pilot, where we did not see very much of an increase at 12 watts per kilogram. So as I mentioned yesterday, we tried to increase those as much as we could. But again, we have a certain, as Dr. Kapstick mentioned yesterday, there's a limited number of amplifiers that were integrated into the system. So there was an upper limit to the power that we could deliver in these chambers. So this 15 watts per kilogram was primarily based on the fact that there was an upper limit to this capacity of exposure. And as I mentioned, continuously, these exposures for all of these studies were conducted over the course of the 18 hours and 20 minutes a day, for 10 minutes on for the modulation that the animal was being exposed to. I know yesterday there were some clarification issues that the animals were only exposed to either GSM or CDMA. So again, the exposure to whichever modulation that they were exposed to was for an actual 9 hours and 10 minutes throughout the day. And again, in the 28-day studies, just like we did in the thermal pilot, we evaluated body temperature. We did this at 7 different time points over the course of the 28-day study, and you can find those the specific results in the laboratory report. I'll just go quickly over the summary of the findings from the 28-day studies. I'm going to lump together GSM and CDMA since we really did not see much in the 28-day study. In fact, we saw no exposure-related effects on clinical signs of toxicology, no changes in the organ weights or histopathology. I'm sorry, we didn't actually do that's a misprint. Histopathology we did. I was thinking hematology. So in the histopathology, we actually didn't see any effects that were related to treatment, regardless of whether this was GSM or CDMA. In the males, we did observe that there was an increase in body temperature or higher body temperatures compared to controls. In the GSM study, this was observed at all of the exposures at 5, 10, and 15 watts. And for the CDMA exposures, these were observed at 10 and 15 watts per kilogram. And these are basically the total findings from the 28-day studies. So we'll move into the 2-year studies. For the 2-year studies, as we've mentioned previously, there were more animals in this study. As we mentioned, there were 90 animals in the terminal group, but we started off with 105 animals, 105 males, 105 females of mice per power level, per modulation. These exposures were for 7 days a week for up to 106 weeks. As I mentioned, we did have an interim time point, which I'll mention in a minute. Similar to the 28-day studies, animals were initiated with exposure at 5 weeks of age, and the exposures for the 2-year studies were 2.5, 5, and 10 watts per kilogram. Again, this goes back to the 10 was selected primarily based on the limitations of the capacity of the exposure system. When you add more animals, as we had heard yesterday with the SARs, is related to body weights. As we increase the mass of animals or the number of animals in the chamber, we need to increase the power levels. And again, as I mentioned, we had a limited number of amplifiers to raise the powers beyond a certain point. We need to take into account, and actually Dr. Capstick took into account the body weight curves of the animals as well as their survival to calculate what the power levels would be at the maximum through the study, so we could determine what the upper limit would be. Again, 14-week evaluation. We looked at hematology, organ weights, and histopathology. We took 10 animals per group. This is where the other 15 animals went from the 105 down to the 90. So 15 of those animals were taken at the 14-week time point, leaving 90 to continue on to the end of the study. So 10 of those animals were taken for the hematology, organ weights, and histopathology, as well as sperm motility count and vaginal cytology. 5 mice were then used for the gene tox assays that Christine Witt mentioned this morning, both the COMET and the micronucleus assay. So we didn't actually see any effects on hematology or organ weights or histopathology at the 14-week time point. The only endpoint that we have to discuss really is the gene tox. So what we found for the micronucleus test was that in the mice, whether it was male or females, regardless of CDMA or GSM exposure, there was no increase in the frequency of micronucleated immature or mature erythrocytes in either male or females exposed after that 14-week exposure. When we look at the COMET assay, we actually do see that there was some positive findings here. Again, just to reiterate, I think Christine mentioned this a little bit this morning, but we evaluated 3 different tissues, the brain, the liver, and blood. In the brain, we looked at 3 different regions. We looked at the frontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the cerebellum. As you can see here, we saw positive findings in the frontal cortex of male mice. This was regardless of the modulation. We saw this occur in both GSM and CDMA studies. And we saw a positive finding in the female mice in the blood leukocytes in the CDMA studies. So I'll show you, here are the dot plots showing the individual animals and the group means for each of the treatment groups. For the male frontal cortex, on the left-hand side of the slide, you see the CDMA results, and on the right-hand side, you see the GSM results. And you could see, we'll use this. You can see here that there was a statistically significant increase in the trend with increasing SAR. And you can see that there was pairwise significance at each of the exposure levels, and there appears to be a SAR-dependent increase in this effect. We also see the same thing with GSM. We see that there's a statistically significant trend and that there's a statistically significant increase in a pairwise fashion at the highest exposure at 10 watts per kilogram. And these then were considered positive results for the COMET assay. For females, again, we saw a positive finding in the female leukocytes. Again, this is the dot plot for female mice. In this case, all 3 dose groups were significantly different from the control, although there was no trend. Because it seems like this is somewhat of a flat response. However, that there is a significant increase at each of these exposures. And you can see this is a little bit of what Christine was talking about this morning. This was more prevalent in the rats than in the mice, but we do see some significant inter-individual variability within these individual animals. So skipping to the end of the 2-year study, these are the survival curves for both GSM and CDMA males. We did see that there was increased survival in the males at 5 watts per kilogram in the GSM studies. This only occurred at 5 watts per kilogram. It did not occur at the higher exposures. We also saw in the CDMA study that there was an increase in survival at the 2.5 watts per kilogram. And again, this was not observed at the 5 or 10 watts per kilogram exposures. So here's the summary of all the clear findings that we had. As you can see, there's none here. Most of what we saw was equivocal. So all the histopathological findings that I'll be presenting were considered equivocal findings in these studies. Here's just a summary of the lesions. We'll go through these one at a time in the upcoming slides. I just wanted to point out that we'll look at GSM first. We'll look at the GSM males. We see 2 lesions in the GSM males that were the malignant fibrous histiocytoma in the skin and alveolar bronchular adenoma and carcinoma combined incidences in the lung. And then in the females, we already talked about this a little bit today, but we'll look at the malignant lymphomas, which occurred in both the GSM and CDMA females. And also we'll look at the liver hepatoblastoma, the call that was made on the liver hepatoblastoma in the CDMA males. So we'll be seeing a lot of these over the next day or next 2 days. So this is the way that all of our data is presented in these presentations. Across the top, we see the number that was examined, number of the animals that had, or in this case, the number of mice that had this lesion. So this was 1 out of 90, and so forth. So we see here that there is a higher incidence at 5 and 10 watts compared to control for the combined incidence, as well as just the malignant fibrous histiocytoma. So we considered these as the combination of the lesions because these were all arose from the same tissue of origin. So we see that there is a higher level at 5 and 10 watts per kilogram compared to controls. However, there was no statistical significance, there was no significant trend, and there was no significant pairwise finding here. But the incidences at 5 and 10 watts per kilogram do exceed the historical control, which is seen down here at the bottom of this slide. You see 2 out of 589 animals. The average was 0.3, with a range of 0 to 2%. These are incidences. 5 out of 90 is 5.5%, 4 is 4.4%. So you can see that these exceeded the range, but again, these were not statistically significant. Based on these findings, we determined that this was an equivocal finding. Since we didn't see a dose response, we didn't see statistical significance, we did see it exceed historical control. So these decreased our confidence that this lesion would actually be related to exposure of RFR. So we move to the lung. As I mentioned, if you look at the combined incidences of alveolar bronchular adenoma or carcinoma, we see that there is a statistically significant trend for the combo with increase. You see that there was a trend with increasing SAR. However, there is no significant pairwise comparison when you look at any of these elevated incidences compared to the controls. However, if you look at the incidence here compared to the historical control incidences, you see that this 24%, and the range is 16 to 34%. These values here, if you convert them to percentages, are 36% for the 5 and 38% for the 10 watts per kilogram. So these actually do slightly exceed the historical control values. So because this was a positive trend, but there was no pairwise significant, not necessarily an increasing SAR-dependent response that was statistically significant, pairwise, this decreased our confidence that these, again, were related to the RF exposure. So we considered this to be an equivocal finding. Moving on to the malignant lymphomas. These are in GSM females. We did see a statistically significant pairwise increase at the low and mid dose groups. We didn't see a statistically significant trend. What's interesting here is that we see the largest increase here at the lowest exposure, and then smaller increases at the 5 watts per kilogram. And then although the incidence at 10 watts per kilogram was not statistically significant, it did actually exceed the control, the concurrent control in this case. However, as mentioned earlier today, the historical control is much different than the concurrent control. We see in this lesion, in this current study, there was a 2% incidence in this lesion. When you look at the historical control range, this includes, as was talked about earlier, this includes the 2% from this study. If you were to exclude this study, the lowest incidence that was observed in any of the other studies was 10%. So the average here is 16% if you, in this case, but if you exclude the current study, the lowest incidence that was observed is 10%. And you can see that this exceeds that 10%. This is right about at that 10%. So with no SIR-dependent increase per se, and the incidences here were all within the historical control range. Again, we've discussed the historical controls, and this would be a discussion for the panel, but we see that since these did not exceed the historical control range, this decreased our confidence in combination with the statistical evaluation and everything else that I had mentioned. So we then determined that these were equivocal findings as well. We'll switch to look at CDMA exposures. So for CDMA exposures, we did see an increase specifically here in hepatoblastoma, but if you look at this data, you see that there is a significant increase of the hepatocellular adenomas at the 2.5 watts per kilogram. And when you combine these lesions, you look at the adenomas and carcinomas, it seems like there may be a little bit of a push here, that there's more adenomas than carcinomas, but when you look at them together, it seems like there's about the same numbers. When you add in the hepatoblastomas and you look at all of these lesions together, it seems like there's a flat incidence, that there's no increase. But when we specifically look at hepatoblastoma, we do see that there is a significant increase at the 5 watts per kilogram exposure. And although these are linked together with this group, I'll let one of the pathologists correct me, but I believe that the hepatoblastoma is a little bit different in the sense that it may or may not arise from the adenomas or carcinomas. So this may be slightly different. And so looking at just this hepatoblastoma, because we see that the total burden of neoplasms in the liver is about similar, we do actually see that something specific may be happening here with hepatoblastoma. But this incidence is exceeds the historical control range here. However, since we only saw this at the 5 watts per kilogram and we don't see any changes at the lower or the high dose, this reduced our confidence, and we determined that this was an equivocal finding. In CDMA, we saw similar results for females as we saw with the GSM females. Again, this 2%, as I mentioned, was the lowest that we've observed in any of our studies in the HSD rat to this point. In the mice to this point. And again, we see a statistically significant increase at the low dose. If you remember from GSM, the increase was in both the low and mid dose. Here we see the increase in just the low dose. We do see higher incidences at the upper 2 exposure levels. However, again, these were not statistically significant. We didn't see a statistically significant trend. And when you bring in the historical control, all of the exposures here, even the highest exposure here, the incidence of 9 is about 9.9 or 10%, which would be the lowest level that was observed in the historical controls from the other studies. So based on this, again, we consider this to be an equivocal finding. So those were all the findings that we report from the mouse study. I'll move, my last 2 slides are the conclusions. So based on this information, the NTP concluded that there was equivocal evidence of carcinogenicity in male B6C3F1 mice exposed to GSM radiofrequency radiation at 1900 megahertz. This was based on the combined incidences of fibrosarcoma, sarcoma, and malignant fibrous histiocytoma in the skin, as well in the males as the incidences of alveolar, bronchular, adenoma, or carcinoma combined. For females, for GSM, we also found that there was equivocal evidence of carcinogenic activity based on the incidences of the malignant lymphomas that were observed in all organs. There were no incidences of increases of non-neoplastic lesions that were observed in this study. When we look at CDMA exposures, we conclude that there was equivocal evidence of carcinogenicity in the male mice exposed to the CDMA modulated cell phone RF at 1900 megahertz. This was based on the incidences of hepatoblastomas in the liver. And in females, we concluded that there was equivocal evidence based on the incidences of malignant lymphoma in all tissues. And again, for the CDMA studies, we didn't see any increase in any of the non-neoplastic lesions that would be considered biologically relevant. And that's the end. Take any questions of clarification?
Thank you. Question from Ms. Reyes.
Lydia Andrews-Jones. I wanted to get some clarification on the skin malignant fibrous histiocytoma incidence. It says in the footnote that for that particular tumor that all of the lesions were on the tail except for one, and that one was on the pinna, which from what we saw yesterday were the two areas of the mouse that were most exposed. And then when I go back and I look at the other groups, there were actually two of these in the male. There were actually three of these tumors in the males in the CDMA as well as the GSM exposed group. And those were in the low and the mid dose group. And then there's a total of, in the females exposed to GSM, there's a total of 4 of these tumors, also in the low and the mid dose group. And the females with the CDMA, there's a total of 2 of these tumors, 1 each in the low and the mid dose group. So we're not seeing the dose response up to the high dose group. But what is the historical control incidence in the female mice would be my first question. And with this number, and especially the location, and it's not clear what the location was of the malignant fibrous histiocytomas in these other animals, because it's just listed in the tables. It does specifically say that the fibrosarcoma and the sarcoma were not on the tail, but it doesn't say if it wasn't on the pinna. But I just wanted some clarification around that.
Right. And actually, I'm going to defer mostly to Dr. Briggs because she actually has gone back and taken a look at that, historically where those lesions were found. And I think she'll elaborate, but I think most of those lesions in previous studies were also found on the tail and the pinna as well.
Yes, this is Amy Briggs. So I did, in preparation for this, I went back and I looked at studies. I just took 5 studies based on the recent peer reviews that we've had, and of studies that had at least 1 or 2 of these tumors in the group. I did not strictly confine them to control groups, but I looked at them regardless of what group they were in. But it was 2 to 4% incidence in any group, and none of these tumors had a call made on them. I found 13 animals that had malignant fibrous histiocytomas in them, with a total of 14 tumors. 1 animal had 1 on the pinna and 1 on the tail, just like one of the animals in this study. Of those 14 tumors, 10 were on the tail, 1 was on the ear pinna, 1 was in the preputial area of the skin, 1 was in an animal with skin and mesentery, it was metastatic, and 1 was in multiple organs but not in the skin. In the current study, we had 1 of the tumors that was not on the skin only, and it was metastasized throughout the mesentery as they do when they metastasize. That was the control. And all the rest were on the tail. They did not metastasize, or on the pinna or the tail in the exposed animals. None of them metastasized, nor did they look as aggressive as the one in the control animal. So that's the information I can tell you about that. I don't think the location was unique to these studies.
Yes.
Amy, just to follow up, can you tell us where on the tape? Oh, sorry, Matthias Rinke from Germany, a retiree, and serving a lot of time for the READER database that collects tumors. And so tail is just an organ, but do we know whether there was the same location? So what we saw yesterday from these pictures, there was the location, or the highest are on the transition between the body and the tail. Do we know where the tumors were located in this case? And another question to that as well, we learned this morning that siblings might be, or littermates might be considered, and were they in any way related to each other?
So as far as the location on the tail, during the individual animal necropsy record, it would just be recorded as tail. But I can tell you in several of the tumors that I examined from this study and previous studies, I could see pigment in the lesion. So I assume it was somewhere near the tattoo, which would be in the proximal half the tail, but obviously right not next to the body. As far as the statistics, I do believe in mice we would have no way of knowing that, because I don't think they keep records when they send us the mice and they weren't perinatally exposed.
Yeah, the discussion of the litter mates was primarily for the rat report.
Other questions? Yes.
Just another clarification. So the lesions were mostly seen in the tail, but the tail's not a standard tissue that is collected. So was the examination of the tail only occurred if there was a gross lesion? Is that correct?
So these lesions were predominantly trace gross lesions. It would hold true also for the pinna, which is not a protocol-required tissue. And for most of the skin lesions, ones that were found on the toe or somewhere else in other studies. But the tail is examined in every animal for this. So
Grossly examined.
grossly, yes.
Other questions? Yes, Dr. Hoffman first.
Wolfgang Kaufmann, retiree. I have a question with respect to the nervous system. The nervous system is one of the reasons maybe we've done that study, because that is of a major concern. And now we see that the dissectioning of the brain in mice and rats differs. We have three sections in mice and seven sections in the brain. What I would be interested in, the tumors and hyperplastic lesions you have found in rats, are they, when you compare the three planes with the rat planes, did you had the feeling that this was comparable, or you found in rats in that locations tumors or hyperplastic lesions?
Amy Bricks, and we did take 7 sections from the mice too. They were sections similar to rats.
Okay. Okay, so it was comparable. Great.
Dr. Lin?
Yeah, a point of clarification with regard to the female GSM mouse, where you had a dose-dependent lymphoma finding. I thought the statistics was fairly clear in that case. I wonder how was the decision made to classify them as equivocal?
Yeah. I think just walking through our thinking again was that, and I'll just use the GSM as an example. For the case of GSM, we did see the statistically significant increase, but again, it was only at the low and mid dose group. So there was no trend test, so there was no necessarily an SAR dependent trend. And in fact, if you look, as you increase SAR, it seems like the incidence actually goes down. So we didn't see anything here at the top dose group. And again, we pulled in for this lesion the historical controls, which have been discussed a bit. But again, because this incidence of the historical controls was much higher than what we're seeing here, that also played into our decision to call this equivocal evidence.
Dr. Corcoran and then Dr. Adler.
Thank you, Dr. Wyde. I know this is an exceptional study for a wide variety of reasons. In your experience with a chemical article of interest for a study of this nature, are there instances where you see statistically positive results of increased tumors for low and intermediate dosing, but nothing at the high end of the dosing, and you have reached a conclusion that is not equivocal?
We've done over 500 tech reports. I'm sure that we have done that before. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. Maybe Dr. Bucher or somebody who's
So-
been with the program a lot longer might.
There, all
ahead.
right. Well, I was going to say there are cases of that, and sometimes taken into account, you may have low survival at the top dose, and now you may not see the response going all the way up to the top dose. But there are cases of where we may call some, where we only see the effect at the mid dose.
So linearity versus nonlinearity is a very hot topic within radiation biology. And I'll return to that comment when I come around and make my comments in total.
Did you want to add anything? Okay. Okay, Dr. Adler.
So, different topic, same study. If we have a comet positive assay for frontal cortex at 14 weeks in the mice, but at 2 years we have no evidence of brain tumors. If the result was different from that, meaning we had positive brain tumors, we'd all be going, eureka, aha, we found the Holy Grail. So, in fairness, scientifically, I think we should try to understand, for example, what's the latency period for DNA-induced brain tumors in mice? Is the study adequate to show that? Or is there another explanation to help us understand why a very clear genetic damage signal does not have an outcome of positive brain tumors?
Well, I'll just address a little bit, and then I'll let Christine talk a little bit more. But I don't think that there's ever been any direct association with the positive finding in a comet assay, definitely meaning that there would be an increase following 2 years of exposure. I think when we look at the comet assay, that's a snapshot in time also, so that doesn't take into account DNA repair and other processes which may be involved. So I think you kind of have an incomplete story if we just look at that and try to compare those two. I agree with you. I think if we saw the tumors, that would be great. And you would more easily be able to tie those together. And I think, even when we talk about our conclusions, we talk about under the conditions of this study. And I think we have to be careful. Under the conditions of this study, this assay was positive for that comet finding. But again, this doesn't take into account any of the other factors that may play, like DNA repair or other processes.
Dr. Witt, would you like to add anything to that? I would just note that the erythrocyte micronucleus test was negative in these animals, but the comet test was positive.
Yes, I can't add anything to what Dr. Wyde said. He captured it all.
Okay, let's see. I'm over to Dr. Rinke.
Yeah, Matthias Rinke again. In this case, I would have found it of advantage if the preneoplastic lesions would have been considered for the lymphomas as well, because in the spleens, the controls have the highest incidence of lymphoid hyperplasia, which usually or frequently this tumor starts in the spleen. So it might be just a chance of the age, and would support the opinion that this is rather equivocal than being anything.
Amy Bricks, yes, I agree with you. We usually do look at the hyperplasias, and the lymphoid hyperplasias in the spleen in the controls were 11, and in all of the dose groups, CDMA and then GSM went 10, 12, 14, 7, 13, 10. So there wasn't really any indication that anything there was markedly abnormal between the groups.
Dr. Barnes and Dr. Felton.
I just comment that the data we have does indicate that nonlinearities are important. And we have data that shows that one dose we're increasing the growth rate of fibrosarcoma, in another case mastocytoma, changed the values a little bit, and we're decreasing the growth rate. And again, so our experience is that these things are very nonlinear. I would not expect a linear dose increase in terms of the data we have.
Dr. Felton.
Susan Felter, can you share a little bit more about, in the NTP's background, all the factors that go into consideration of the final interpretation of data that are borderline in some cases, includes consideration of time to first tumor, right? And that's not something that we've talked about, and it could be something that would contribute to the weight of evidence, And I would call attention specifically to the skin tumors, which are a little challenging, but there's a clear tendency. Well, I shouldn't say clear tendency. The data in this study show that the latency period in the high dose male mice was much shorter than the others, and then there is a progression. In other cases, it goes the other way around. And in the dosed animals, you don't see anything until terminal sacrifice, whereas you saw it earlier in controls. I think it should be something that, given the challenges that you're faced with the limited controls, that it should be at least qualitatively included in the discussion. And I had a clarifying question about the skin tumors as well. And I think you said it, I apologize, I want to make sure. For the historical controls in the tables in the report, it does not specifically say, but it does include the data from this study are included?
Yes, that's
so
correct.
Then with the malignant fibrous histiocytomas, there's only 1 out of 589, and that one came from this study? Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd have to look at I don't have the numbers in front of me, but
No,
I think that's correct.
PCT.
Two.
There was one in PCTFT, and there was one in one study that just dropped off this year.
So the table for historical control says 1 total.
That's an error. We'll have to fix that.
Okay. That would be meaningful to me, though, in terms of if you've never ever seen it in any other study versus you have. So.
No, we had one in a study that's in here, and we had one in a study that just dropped off the historical controls because of the 5-year.
Okay.
I just want to address your question about the time to tumor question. I think we have to be careful because this is only reflected in the animals once they've been either found dead or moribund. So it's not the time to the first appearance of the tumor, it's the time to the first time that we saw it. And you can't see it until the animal is necropsied. And so you have to be careful because we don't know. I mean, that tumor could have developed a long time before that. And so as far as talking about latency period, you have to be careful. And sometimes we do include that. It depends on the situation.
So a quick follow-up to that. But these were skin tumors, right? So these were grossly visible. So I think your points are very valid in general, but I'm wondering whether it holds true for these.
But yeah, no, these were microscopic observations, not gross observations.
I'd like to point out that these tumors were probably not the cause of death of the animals, so they may have had them. The animal may have died from something else and had this, whereas the time that they first occurred might not have been.
And that wouldn't be noted during. I mean, if you saw a tumor on the
clinical observation.
On tail, yeah.
But I think the values that we have are when the animal was necropsied, if they had it at that point.
So I don't want to cut off this discussion, but I do want to remind us that we will have time for discussion of everything once we've heard from the peer reviewers. So these are very good lines of discussion, but keep in mind that we haven't yet heard from the peer review comments, and I think once then we've heard from everybody, it may be good to revisit some of these things. But I'm happy to hear if others still have other questions for Dr. Wyde. Dr. Harkman.
Jack Harkman of Michigan State. Maybe, I don't know how to do this. It's not really for you, but it's for Amy. Okay, and so I just wanted to get your impression as a pathologist and looking at these about what was your reaction to the low lymphoma?
I'm struggling with it because I didn't know, and what I really, 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 really wanted was that second control group.
And and could you just, is this fair or not? I don't know. If this is all right? Yeah. Okay. Well, what would that second control look like?
I think it would have had 6. I don't know. You mean you're asking me what I think? How many would have been in there?
No. I'm not hiding anything here. I'm intrigued by the fact that with the discussion this morning that we had also about background.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued by the chambers and nothing coming in or coming out of that. And please forgive me, I'm not a radiobiologist at any means here, but if you have those animals in there, and if you had another control group that were similarly caged but outside of the chamber, to me that would have been a really, really nice addition to it. But that's retrospect here. But I just wanted to understand if that is what you meant here, because
We've discussed how nice that would have been too. It's just, controls that weren't in a chamber as well as another chamber of controls. But we just have to go with what we have, and I don't, it is very interesting theory that they were actually protected. The hyperplasias were flat, so I don't know,
But there's a lot in carcinogenicity between hyperplasia and
especially in mice with
and
the
so I'm not a big fan of lumping stuff together like that and whatever. But anyway, you make a point. So
yeah, I can't address as to whether that was, a factor in it.
Dr. Andrew Jones, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is for you, Amy, I think. If just as a consideration, because the tumors on the tails were the only tails examined were the ones that had gross lesions to induce the examination of the tail. Has there been any consideration, because apparently the tails were collected because that's where the identification is, to going back and trimming in all those tails to increase the confidence that you haven't missed a microscopic lesion?
We did not go back and trim in all the tails, but we did go back and look at all the tails grossly, and we did pick up one additional one during the audit of pathology specimens. They were looked at fairly closely, again, grossly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we will now move into our peer review comments. Dr. Haro, I know that you had asked a question. I would like to hold those until the discussion period. Thank you. Dr. Harkema, you are first on the list.
So first off, we were to comment on the study design, conduct, and findings. So a lot of the study design we talked about yesterday, and so most of my comments are going to be more addressed what you should add in or take out. But I do want to make some statement on the study design and conduct, but very short. And that is the scientific and technical elements of the experimental design and conduct of the mouse study followed very well the general format of the NTP, the 28-day study, the 14-week interim evaluation, and the 2-year studies. And they were all well designed, justified, and executed. The addition of the genetic toxicology studies, the micronucleus, and common assays were also appropriate based on existing understanding, current concerns, and data gaps of the cell phone RFR toxicology and carcinogenesis. Like I said yesterday, I think that you maybe could have gained some other additional information. I don't know how much, but if you had an additional, outside of the 2-year study, you had an additional longer number of you looked at exposure for a longer period of time because of other studies that I'm familiar with inhalation exposure studies where tumors aren't seen until much later. And especially because this was such a unique and high profile chronic study, I think it would be totally justified. On the other hand, I think it was superbly done, and I really had no red flags here. And actually, my only red flag was maybe the lymphomas, and I think you answered that really well this morning. I think what I have kind of learned through this process, we learned a lot more from your presentations that you really have to carefully look and see what bringing back into the report in terms of more clarity. And so that's a general overview statement. I think a lot of us, when we read the report, I'm speaking for others, it should be just me. When I read the report, there were some unanswered questions that I think could have brought out. And so with that, I'll go right into that. And one is, I think a really clear and more precise description, as we talked about, of the historical control data. And you answered a lot of that. I still have a little bit of question about the 5-year cutoff part, that you only go back 5 years in terms of historical control, bringing in those specific comments of exactly what the historical controls and what their makeup, and you answered, these were a certain number of gavage studies, other ones were inhalation. Those, I think, just to give maybe an appendix or somewhere, but just to bring that out. And yesterday, I think we learned a lot about noise levels and measurements, and these and we're, I think that has to be brought out in more detail as well. The time of day of that mice were exposed, for the mice, that they should be added, I think, to the methods and discussed in terms of animal activity during the RFR exposure. What I mean by that, when I looked at where you actually grafted out, it seems to me that a lot of your exposure, and this pertains to the rats too, was in that afternoon or evening, if I'm correct, and where there was most activity of the animals. Because you had, earlier, did you take the time out to change cages and other stuff? So that should be brought out. And also the lighting. Maybe that was in there, but I don't remember that. So all those details, I think, are really important. And more discussion on, this is an issue I often raise with these technical reports. The strengths and limitations of the study and the data gaps that remain. I still think that more of that should be placed in a technical report. You cover it really well in manuscripts, but I think that some people are just going to read the technical reports and clearly stating, well, we didn't have enough controls, okay, or our control should have been this. That I would have liked to seen up front. And then more discussion on maybe this pertains more with the rats, but somewhat with the mice too, is you putting lesions in bins. These are neoplastic lesions, these are non-neoplastic lesions, but the discussion of the influence of those, and that's probably more pertaining to the rats but there's some things with the mice too, that integration for that. I agree totally with the conclusions of equivocal evidence of carcinogenic activity in the 2-year study. But I think it would be stronger if you would not just say why it fits in that category, but also why it doesn't rise to the higher category. So I would add that in too. So I think that gives it more strength to it. And then even though we were asked to look at these in terms of, we're the rat group and the mouse group, you're going to be rewriting a report on the whole thing and a summary and an integration. So I would think that you would write comparisons section just on the comparison of the rat and mice and what that means. The similarities, but also the and that really helps in the comparative approach of medicine now and translation and everything. I think looking at between species is really helpful. Let's see here. And I mentioned earlier that the specific differences between the categories of equivocal and some, to me, still are narrower than some of the other ones. And so that's why I suggested that you talk a little bit more about why it doesn't go up to the some. I also mentioned earlier that I think there needs to be more clarity in the report on the justification for all the doses, not just the high doses, but explain why, why did you select the lower in the middle. And then, like I said just a minute ago, I'm intrigued by the fact that there might be background, and that putting them into these cages that, chambers, that may be something that other people want to explore, because there's the lymphomas. Why do you have such low? Maybe it was that the radiation was cut off, or there could be many others, but you're focusing on this, and that seems to be very intriguing. So overall, well done, and these are fairly minor suggestions, but I think it would improve the read a little bit.
Thank you, Dr. Harkema. Do any of the panelists have questions on Dr. Harkema's comments? Not? Okay, thank you, Jack. Dr. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Harkema, for your comments. They're very insightful, and we'll take all of those under advisement and incorporate most of those in. First, I want to talk about we talked a little bit yesterday about the length of the study, 2 years versus a lifetime study, and I think we addressed some of those statistical issues surrounding that. But also, we also have, if you let those go out longer, you have more common tumors that arise as well, and that complicates the interpretation of the study. So, I think the NTP has kind of created this as a standard. And Dr. Shockley could go into more of, if you wanted him to, as far as the statistic issue are concerned. But that's the reason why we kept those to 2 years.
And and that's I understand that in this case with the rats. Maybe not. Maybe you would get more. Most of those rats are going to die from the renal, so you can't predict that. All I know from experience, with limited experience, but with inhalation toxicology studies, some major, if we had not gone longer, we would have missed a dramatic rise in tumors from diesel engine exhaust, for example. So that's just a comment, but that's very minor.
Any other responses from?
Well, I've got a couple. I was just going to address some of those comments so we can. So let's see. So the other thing that you had mentioned was the historical control, and I think Dr. Bucher had mentioned before. We used to put historical controls individually in the bag. I think right now it's lumped together, and I think that's a good idea, especially for something like the malignant lymphoma, where this doesn't necessarily capture what's going on with all those other studies. In this study, the range shows for the historical controls from 2 to 6 to 38, even though the 2 is from this study, the lowest one from the other studies is 10. And I don't think that information is available in this report. And so I think that's a great recommendation. And so we'll go ahead and change that as well. And as far as the noise, that was something that was brought up and kind of discussed quite a bit yesterday. So I won't really go over that, but I do think that maybe we can add some more information into the report to kind of clarify this. And I think that ties together with another one of your comments, which was that these presentations really clarified a lot of issues for you. And I think that I heard that a lot yesterday as well. And I think when we leave here after tomorrow, that'll be one of the main things that we look at, is trying to incorporate incorporate those things that were more clear, that we made more clear here, and incorporate those into the report itself to make the report more readable and easier to understand.
And one of the other things I forgot to mention is lighting. I think that's important.
Right, and we can address the lighting issue as well. We could put that in, and I know you'd also mentioned about the activity as far as like the timing of the exposures, and I know Dr. Capstick in his talk, if you were paying attention yesterday, he actually did show like what those hours were, and we can add those into the report, the specific times. And again, as I mentioned yesterday, there was early morning. I think it was from 7 to 10 in the morning, and then afternoon, I think from 2 to 4 were the husbandry hours. So all the other times during the day and overnight, that was when the exposures occurred. So we'll make sure that we add that information into the report as well. I think it was a great comment that you made about not just talking about why it was considered equivocal, but pointing out why it didn't rise to that next higher level. And we'll try to be more clear about that as we look at each of the lesions and kind of bolster some of the equivocal versus some point that you brought up as well. Otherwise, as far as the comparison between the rats and mice, I think we've had some internal conversations about whether that would go into the report or not. I personally see that maybe as a manuscript afterwards, where we could really be free to discuss what was happening in specifically between the two exposures. That'll be something that we'll talk about internally after this meeting as well.
That it? Okay. Any other staff have any responses? Okay, thank you, Jack. Dr. Corcoran.
Thank you, Dr. Eaton. I'll stick pretty close to my prepared remarks here that were submitted a week ago, but I have made some annotations. I want to begin by reiterating a comment you've heard several times in the last day and a half from a number of panelists that the NTP is to be commended for conducting a one-of-a-kind study with a unique model and following what many acknowledge is the gold standard for design and conduct. I want to make sure I have that as my lead comment. On the design, quite a significant body of published studies in this area have examined the health effects of radiofrequency radiation exposures in rodents. The present study distinguishes itself from others with respect to several key design factors, including the very large animal groups, rodents that are unrestrained and singly caged, and then being exposed to 2 different radiation frequencies over 5, 14, and 28 days and 2 years. The design of the study, and this holding in mind that this is a hazard identification study, appears to be comprehensive and robust to me throughout. There are sound rationales for selection of each study design and performance parameter. These include a very rigorously validated reverberation type chamber and exposure system, animal species and strains, sham controls, and exposed animal group sizes, RFR exposure levels and duration, clinical pathology and genetic testing measures, statistical methods, quality assurance, and means employed to monitor and assess each parameter. There's healthy debate over the use of various models and understanding the health impact of radiation, and models for assessing the health impacts in specific of radiofrequency exposure. The impact of results and conclusions from this very comprehensive study will be considered by most everyone, I would imagine, within the context of the strengths and challenges of this model. And this gives me an opportunity to make a recommendation that the technical report have a section that indicates what's considered to be the strengths and weaknesses of the model. Now, the strengths and weaknesses of the report, I would recommend be deferred to a later point, so the the technical report stands on its own merit, and it's left to others to judge the strengths and weaknesses without being pre-influenced by the report itself. Okay. So there's no question this innovative model introduces both strengths and weaknesses. The innovations of the model appear to be on balance to be an important advancement in the ability to study the health impacts of RFR and identify hazards. How about the conduct of the study? The large scale and complexity and meticulousness of the present study, they presented formidable challenges to its conduct. These factors, any one alone, but particularly in combination, can degrade the accuracy of exposures, completeness of data collection, and security of subsequent findings. Despite a study design that has required a very large number of observations and measurements, a review of the conduct of the study has produced no apparent evidence to me that the study findings have been compromised due to study conduct. So no significant issues were found for the conduct of the study. On to findings. The report states that the body weights of male and female mice exposed to GMS RFR over 2 years were similar to sham controls throughout the study. I've just got a little bone of contention with the use of the word similar. The body weight standings being described as similar, to me, are ambiguous. It's neither they were different or they were not different, which you usually expect to derive from a statistical handling of the null hypothesis. So you expect a binary response, and the use of the term similar leaves me uncertain, and it leaves the report ambiguous without this being addressed. On to a little more technical matter. A number of the naming values in table G1 and in other tables have standard error values of 0.00. Now, just to clarify, does this mean that the variance was actually 0 and each of the measurements was identical? Or is there another basis for having a 0.00 variance reported? The report would be strengthened by a greater discussion of why the occurrence of lesions and sham controls fell at or below the historical range for these tumors. Although this finding is clearly noted in the report, and I have no reason to doubt the validity of those observations, the report does not give adequate weight to discussing the impact of the outcome of these very low values for certain tumors in the sham controls versus the historical experience of these studies, and what impact this has on drawing conclusions, and particularly the equivocal conclusion in the mouse studies. The report makes reference to pairwise comparisons of parameters for study groups that are statistically significant or non-significant using the Dunnett's test, well-known test, for normally distributed variables. The report would benefit tremendously from confirming and briefly assessing how cumulative type 1 error associated with a large number of individual controls has been maintained at a value of less than P05. So there's a concern that there's a excessive size of type 1 error in the evaluation of the results. Overall, no issues were observed that would significantly limit the validity of the reported findings and the conclusions upon which they are based. And this leads me to information that should be added or deleted. Major considerations in classifying evidence for RFR-related carcinogenic activity as equivocal was the absence of increased lesion incidences and escalating RFR exposure levels and tumor rates in historical control animals. While there is no reason to doubt the validity of the exposure response observations, nor the historical controls, the report does not adequately support the basis for these assertions and would need to include an expanded consideration of linear versus nonlinear causation of cancer, and more specifically commentary on radiation, and then more specifically beyond that, RFR. So the weight of evidence conclusion leading to an equivocal finding for the mouse studies follows a compilation of lines of evidence. And to me, it would depend to some extent on who's in the room when that call is being made. I would like to see something more analytical, such as a rubric with 10 or 15 or 20 factors and a weighting for each factor that would lead you to a weight of evidence determination, and where the findings in this mouse study for each of those factors fell. So you could actually do something more analytical than a field, people in a field, in a room having a field that we are in concurrence or not in concurrence on this. Additional information about the pathology methods would be helpful, and the presentation by Dr. Bricks yesterday was quite helpful, but most of that information did not appear in the report. Is it correct that the number of initial pathology evaluations per tissue was 2, but one by the NTP pathologist and one by the QA pathologist? Now, it's clear to me that is the case. And I'm very glad that in your presentation today, Dr. Bricks, you clarified blinding. And I was not a fan of absence of early blinding, but hearing the very rich discussion on that topic, I've been brought to be a believer in the method that has been used in this study. Given the importance of histopathologic evaluations, more information should be provided about the peer review panels and the pathology working group, including the number of pathologists in each group, the basis for membership in each group, and whether there's any overlap of personnel amongst those or between those two groups. The report would be strengthened by inclusion of a number of cases in which significantly different pathology assessments were encountered. And then there was a resolution of that difference of opinion and whether there was any variation in the number of differences of opinion by tissue site or tumor type. It's inferred from reading the technical report that all pathology evaluations were performed by standard microscopy. But again, the discussion after your presentation today, it's clear that some morphometric analysis was done, and it was used to support conclusions, both on standard conclusions and perhaps breaking what someone might want to call ties. Now, I'm not sure about this next section, how you want to handle this, but there was really a wide range of public comments that are scientific and technical both in nature. And considering these comments, the report appears a little bit parsimonious in acknowledging published findings that meet the standards and relevance of high quality. The report author should consider expanding the discussion of selected published findings that have been brought to note in the public comments. If one looks at the growth rates for male and female mice, there were brief delays around the 550-day mark, and it might be worthwhile if a comment could be made about that, if there's anything known about why that occurred. And if not, it would be worthwhile to say there's nothing known. Now, a little trouble I had following the explanation of levels of evidence of carcinogenic activity. It notes that in some cases genetic toxicology is given consideration. And again, that puts it in the kind of the never-never land of not exactly knowing what you mean by when you say that. So it would be useful to include an explanation for this statement or refer to publications that more fully address how those data are used. Okay. We'll skip that. So to close, this is a study that is that is not perfect, just as every other study out there in the literature, but it has enormous strengths with some challenges. And I would close by saying it's an effort that had very high probative value and contributes a great deal to the existing body of literature.
Thank you, Dr. Corcoran. Before we have NTP staff respond, are there any questions to Dr. Corcoran from the committee? Points of clarification. Yes.
Did you, Susan Felter, did you say that you were in full agreement with all of the draft conclusions? Did you state that up front, or?
Is this our vote at the end?
No,
You mean
well, we'll address.
I'm sorry,
We'll
I-
address that in our discussion after all of the reports. Then
Okay,
we'll
okay.
come back and get clarification.
I can say one thing in response to that is I'm a little bit troubled by the lymphoma data because it was so consistent in both exposure modalities, and the sham controls were so far off scale that in that case I don't believe historical controls contribute much value to the decision process, nor does the linearity of the response contribute much to what I would be thinking about in making a final call, whether it was equivocal or some evidence. So I'll come back to that.
But yeah, we will come back to that. Dr. Adler?
Rick Adler. Dr. Corcoran, I was confused when you said morphometric evaluation of the pathology data. I'm not sure what you're referring to there.
There are some aren't there use of numerical techniques, photographic and computer-driven numerical techniques to derive analytical numbers to support pathological findings.
Are you referring to severity grades?
That would be one.
Okay. Being a pathologist, when you say morphometric, I'm talking about measuring specific things on the slides. When you talk about severity grades, we're talking about the semi-quantitative evaluation that pathologists give to typically non-neoplastic lesions, a grading scheme, and those can be quantitated roughly and given numeric equivalents so people can see if there's some small differences in those numbers. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Dr. Wyde, Dr. Bricks?
Thank you very much, Dr. Corcoran, for your comments. I agree with your term similar. So we went back and took a look at this, and similar, we generally consider similar to be about 10%. It's difficult when you talk about statistics with body weights because a lot of times the statistical tests will pick up statistically significant differences, but these aren't necessarily biologically relevant. So we kind of look at it more from the percentage of difference from the controls. I'm going to go through most of these, and you could. I've got one question that Dr. Shockley could answer. If that doesn't address it, we can kind of push that over to him now. But if not, I'll move forward. The comment about table G1. Some of these, this was a rounding error, so it looks like 0, but it's not. So we'll fix this in the report and make sure that those actual values are there.
It's a minor point.
Right. Your point about the historical control and the concurrent control, I mean, this is something that we've talked about both yesterday and today, and this is something that, I'm sure we'll be talking about later today and into tomorrow. So, again, we've heard a lot from people yesterday and today about the use of the historical controls, and I hear a lot of people saying that we've overused the historical controls here, and we'll continue to have some more discussions on that. But we'll take that into consideration as we finalize the report. As far as the Dunnett's test, I will let Dr. Shockley respond to the type 1 error question, and then I'll come back and continue the other responses.
Okay, Keith Shockley. So you brought up a very important issue, I think, statistically, of type 1 error. You specifically mentioned the Dunnett's test, which actually does correct for multiple comparisons made against the control. But I think maybe the experiment-wise type 1 error is another issue, and maybe what you were alluding to.
Much larger issue.
A much larger issue because so this gets into the multiple comparison issue because we're, in the case of the tumor data, we're making a lot of comparisons, and actually 500 to 800 comparisons or more. And even though one single statistical test here would, if it's properly constructed, control the type 1 error at the 0.05 level, when we're making hundreds of comparisons, we would expect to see potentially many false positives just by chance. So in that respect, it's an important issue, and with our tumor analysis, we do not adjust for multiple comparisons. But I just want to make a few comments to address that issue. First of all, the NTP uses a weight of evidence approach and not a strict statistical decision rule. And so I think that's probably the basis of my response to you. But I would like to address it even further from a more pure statistical perspective. So there actually have been a number of studies in the literature that have looked at the experiment-wide false positive rate in NTP studies and other similar studies. And because we're using this weight of evidence approach versus just a strict statistical decision rule, these studies have indicated that actually experiment-wide the false positive rate is controlled around the 0.05 level. And so a lot of the reports in the literature indicate about a 0.05 to a 0.07 level, experiment-wide. And part of the way you might explain that, even if you were looking at purely at statistics, would just be that there's a difference between the nominal false positive rate of any given statistical test versus the actual false positive rate that would result from that test when we're looking at discrete data. And so even though we're looking at 0-1 outcomes and we're testing at the 0.05 level, the actual false positive rate for any given test, if the background tumor rate is low enough, would actually be quite a bit lower than the 0.05 level. So I actually, I can address this in more detail if desired, but
I think that would be helpful for the readers of the technical report.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
The next comment was on this linear versus nonlinear issue, and we have, overall we have an underlying expectation of linearity. We recognize that nonlinear effects do occur in biology, and more specifically maybe with RFR. I think part of what complicates this even more is we don't understand the mechanism by which some of these things may be occurring. And I think we'll probably get more into this discussion as we discuss later the malignant lymphoma, because I think this is probably a good, as you mentioned, this is probably a good example of where we see this, perhaps potentially this nonlinear effect that we have called equivocal. And so we'll leave this up to this group to discuss that. But we can try to address those issues. We'll take that under advisement. As far as the pathology, there's a bunch of pathology questions, so I'll let Dr. Bricks answer the pathology questions.
Well, most were actually addressed in her presentation. I guess my request really is to make sure that they, in some way or form, make it into the technical report so that the next reader of the technical report doesn't scratch his or her head and say, what do they really mean by that?
Yes, we can do that. I would like to make one comment on your request about the number of changes and things. The vast majority of the changes in here were just terminology.
Because of the atlas, yeah.
And I can tell you that there were no differences in the conclusions made by the study pathologist and us.
Okay, thanks.
And you brought up a good point about some of the more recent literature that's come out, and I think I've heard that from the public comments as well as some of the reviewers, and so we'll evaluate the more recent literature and incorporate those pieces of literature that do support and can be incorporated into the discussion. As mentioned, obviously, about the Ramazzini study, which was not published at the time when we wrote this report, and so we'll take a look at those other publications that we can add in as well.
I'd recommend you not go from parsimonious to overly generous.
So,
But
absolutely.
hold your standards to those which you decide to include.
And I think where there are a couple of publications, there's some key publications that were pointed out by some of the public comments or by some of the reviewers that we definitely will include. But again, we'll, as you mentioned, we'll make sure that we don't overdo it in adding those. We were very careful in the first place with that. As far as the interruption in the body weights, that's an anomaly that we can't really explain. I'm not exactly sure why that happened. We've seen that before sometimes in some other studies, but really we don't have an explanation of why that might be occurring. And as far as the gene tox, I think maybe we could be a little more clear about how that's used. I think that's one of the, it's just one of the things that's considered in our evaluation as far as level of evidence is concerned. So we can try to make that more clear in the report of how we use that data. I think that was all of your comments.
There's one major one which may be unaddressable, and that is more of a analytical rubric for how weight of evidence is determined.
Yeah. So I'll speak to that. This is Chad Blystone. It would be nice to have sort of a checklist, and we could go through and just check and sort of take a rubric approach. But we do find from study to study that just the complexity and the things that occur, the responses that we see, that it's not as straightforward. And this is one of the reasons we're having all of you here to review our conclusions, is that we get this second pass out of our discussions and our what we come to.
Now, if somebody else was giving me that answer, which says, trust me, I wouldn't be quite as trusting as I am with this group here. So thank you for that answer.
Any other comments from NTP staff? Okay, hearing none. Oh.
Just one more comment with the lymphoma, and it is outside the range that we see, but it wasn't just that it's outside the range. We see this quite frequently with female mice, and it's highly variable. And so we have a standard deviations of plus or 8 or 9%. So our historical control window is only 5 years, but if you expand it, it's likely you're going to get these one-offs. So it may be the case, and this is just basically an untestable hypothesis at this point, that the shielding caused a lower value, but we do know that this is based on the historical control, that this is a highly variable tumor. And unfortunately, not just this report, but other reports, we come up against this, where we see something that's really high or really low for the historical control concurrent control compared to the controls.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we will move on. Dr. Lydia Andrew Jones.
Okay, this is Lydia Andrews Jones, and I would also like to start by just commending NTP for the design and execution of this study, and also the rigorousness with which the pathology data has been reviewed, and it is the gold standard in the industry. And so I just want to start my comments with that. The one thing that I am really struggling with from the scientific point of view is the malignant fibrous histiocytomas in the skin, because as you have said, that this is a rare tumor, but we have a total of 11 of these in male mice, and there's a total of 6 of these in female mice in the treated groups, and there's 1 in the control. I'm still not clear on what the historical control incidence is in female mice. And I appreciate the clarification that, the location on the tail and on the pinna is where it has been, this tumor has been seen in previous studies. But I think, the point that the only tails that were examined are those that had gross lesions is something that possibly should come forward to the description of this lesion. And I want to listen to the rest of the discussion, but with this tumor it's not showing a dose response. And that's where I think, the basis for perhaps calling it equivocal. But the large number, we've got 11 in male mice total between the GSM and the CDMA exposed animals, and you've got 1 in your historical control group and 1 in your control group, and that seems like quite a large number of these tumors for this particular study, and perhaps that might bump it up to the level of some evidence rather than just being called equivocal. And I want to put that out for consideration. Then on the comments on the report itself and making this a stronger report, one of the things that I've listened to for the 2 days so far is this is a very complex exposure system that has generated a lot of public interest. And I think that this report ultimately is going to be written not just for the technical and scientific community, but for the public as a whole. And that said, I think there needs, and this has come up several times, there needs to be a more robust explanation of the methods and the language being used in this report in general. And one thing that I thought might be a helpful addition that would be unusual for the formatting of these reports, but would be to have a dictionary for this particular report that might even be hyperlinked in the publication, so that somebody who is not generally familiar with some of the terms being used could have a hyperlink to go back to when we are using this term in this context, this is what we're talking about. And I think that some of the terms that have come up, especially in the more, I'm a biologist. I am not into the physics and the math part of the radiation exposure. And so it was hard for me as a trained scientist to wrap my head around some of what was being done and said, and it was very, very helpful to listen to these presentations, especially yesterday, and I felt that they were very valuable. And, the comment was made previously that perhaps, that should be not just a separate publication, but be brought forward into that report. But then this dictionary, things that people in the public without the scientific training and background might hit on is terms like uncertainty, variation, deviation, and those sort of things. It might be really helpful to define when you're using those terms in the context that they're being used, what they mean. And, there was a slide presented earlier on the language around exposure, and I thought that was a really helpful and brilliant slide. So that, I think, would be really helpful to include in the report as well, or in a dictionary. And I think the challenge in writing up this report is that it needs to be both scientifically and technically sound in what is said, but it also needs to be written in a format that a layperson can understand. And so images, graphs, visual aids are really helpful for that sort of stuff, I think especially for the public. And, the ones that stood out the most to me is the difference between the 900 and 1900 megahertz exposures, and then showing those visuals of the rats or the mice with the overall total body exposure were a really good visual aid for me of why the selection was made for those frequencies. So that would just be an example of where I think that this report would benefit from including some things like that right up front.
So with regard to the issue of, we do prepare a lay summary that will be part of the final report. It's not part of the report we put out as a draft, because obviously we don't have the final conclusions yet, but we do prepare that. And we've also talked internally about how to make some of the information from the eloquent presentations we saw yesterday more integral to or linked to or something. So we're going to think about other ways to try to put some of this technical information in a little more user-friendly form for the reader.
Is that it? Okay, just want to make sure I wasn't cutting you off. So,
well, thank you for your comments. I think there wasn't very many questions in their responses, but there was some great advice, and I think for myself at least, when I resumed this project from Ron when he retired, it was a steep learning curve as far as learning all of the different language that's involved. It's separate from the chemicals, and I think Dr. Blackstone's slide I think really brought that together in kind of demonstrating that there's all these different things like SARs and decibels and other language that people who are biologists don't usually use. And so, I think the idea of a glossary of terms is something that we could consider, especially for some of those things that are more complicated, more technical, that could maybe use to be described maybe in an appendix, so it doesn't interrupt necessarily the flow of the report. So if you need to reflect on that, you can. So I think that's a very good suggestion, and maybe with the hyperlinks that we could consider that. And as far as the tail, we'd mentioned that before, as far as the grossly observed versus histologically, and so we could maybe increase some of the language in the text to make sure that that's pretty clear that that's not a protocol required tissue, and that those were observed during gross observation.
Any other comments, response from NTP staff or consultants? All right, thank you. Dr. Rinke, I believe you were next.
Okay, yeah, many things have been said already. I will add as well that this study was really perfectly done, and I thank for the great diligence that the people have involved into that work. For me, these 2 days were really a learning curve. It's the first time that I'm attending to such a meeting. It is the first time that I really got into contact with this topic, except reading what can be read over in Europe. And I have to say, when I opened the report and had the abstract, I was wondering why the year 1999 was mentioned for the nomination of this project, and I thought I'm in the wrong film, because there was no following explanation why I should now look at this 28 study and the just recently study. So I think this would be of help for anybody who reads this report the first time, for those that are involved. Over all the years, it is absolutely clear what has happened, but for somebody who might read it, that was just confusing. So we were talking about several points already with the lymphomas, but also that we had some kind of early deaths in the control groups. And for me, this was a little bit contradictory, because malignant lymphomas serve frequently as the cause of death. And that was not the case, because we only had these 2 cases with malignant lymphoma. So the question, why is even or do we have a cause of death for the control animals? And maybe that should be elaborated a little bit, whether there are other findings confounding to this background. So, we were talking about the historical control data, I think, over the last 2 days, and there's only one point, not because I have been working on historical control data and the publication of the best practice for the STP, but reading that the references are from the 80s, from our good old friend Haseman and all. I think they should be little bit updated, especially with this 5-year range to be explained. Yeah, the question also that everybody would have liked to have more control groups, of course, and but I think we don't have to raise this again. And confirming to that what Lydia has said, the malignant fibrous histiocytoma would have raised my concern as well, because this is a rare tumor. It has been renamed in the recent years for the in-hand group, so it is now fibrosarcoma pleomorphic, because nobody really knew what to do with this MFH, and it raised my concern, because, and that was why I asked the question before, where were these located? If they are located to the tattoo, that might be an incidental thing. If they would be located directly at the root of the tail, it might be that it could come from the cauda equina or something like that, and would have caused other points. So, yeah, that was maybe looking for the protocols of the necropsy to see whether there's anything that could add maybe to that. Saying that the MFH is a rare tumor, I saw other rare tumors that were not later on discussed any longer, like hibernoma, which should be not so frequently, or the teratomas that were occurring, or and the pituitary tumors that we had in the CDSM group. And I don't know whether it is wise not to mention them all. And my approach, personally, would be to have a little table adding uncommon rare tumors. So at least one would have discussed them. You discussed them with the historical control data that are not available because they are rare tumors. But in the overall list, having so much, or not so much, but an increased number of lesions in different systems, like the pituitary, like the brown fat, and also with the MFHs, I think that would be helpful. Concerning the hepatoblastomas, I was a little bit astonished because for me hepatoblastoma is a very, very rare lesion, and it was nicely described in this, so I presume that maybe the criteria to call it hepatoblastoma arising in hepatocellular adenoma is different criterion than I am used to it. Yeah, and then I only had some additional editorial comments. We learned this morning from Amy, your talk, that you were the NTP pathologist and not the study pathologist, and seeing on the list of contributors you are named the study pathologist. So I thought you had read the entire study, so this should be clarified as well. As well as I was wondering why in the contribution list some people had their duties named after their names, and a bunch of people did not had. I don't know whether this is usually done in that way or whether this could be improved. And what I just yesterday mentioned was there's one sentence that it is said in males there were no common lesions observed between the two modulations, which implies to me everything was uncommon. I think this should be a phrase or a sentence that should be rephrased. Yeah, with that, thank you again for that work. Very well done. And
Thank you. Questions from the panel to Dr. Rinke? If not, NTP staff?
Thank you very much for your comments. This is Amy Bricks, and I read your comment on the malignant fibrous histiocytoma, and I will say I went back and rewrote my paragraph about that. It'll be in the next version, and I think it's a much better written paragraph taking into account your comments. As far as the area on the tail, I did say that in several of the tumors I could actually see the pigment on the tail, so I assume that, of course, we can't speculate as to what that means. We know that malignant fibrous histiocytomas can be induced even by non-carcinogens, just by inserting something in the skin of mice or rats, but we can't really, we didn't design any study to make that conclusion. So as far as the other rare tumors, we felt they were unique enough that they deserved a mention in the results to be pulled out from just the appendices and mentioned there. But we didn't feel that they rose to the level of evidence to make a call, so we usually don't bring those forward to the discussion. But we can discuss putting all of them in a table.
I'll just add, thank you for your comments, and most of your comments I think were editorial and will bolster the understanding of the report. One of the questions, specifically about the nomination in 1999, I hope that yesterday we were able to kind of bridge that gap, more of a historical perspective to get us from 1999 to today, and we'll make sure that in the report that's more clearly defined, so it's not a jump from 1999 to a number of years later. And as far as the malignant fibrohistiocytoma with the increase in the call to some, I think that's some discussion that you guys as a group will have after we conclude the reviewers' comments, and so that could be a discussion that you guys will have.
Thank you. Dr. Pont. Well.
Hi, I'm Kamala Pant. And since people here, they know what they are doing. They are toxicologists and they are pathologists and they are, reverberation chamber experts. So I do genetic toxicology, which is a very small part of big toxicology picture. So I'm mostly going to talk about the COMET assay and the micronucleus assay. And to begin my comments, of course, this was a very well-designed study, and the work was conducted under robust conditions, and there were enough animals to have statistical relevance. And so the study was designed beautifully, and actually, initially when I read this report, I said to myself that, wow, this was ingenious that they could combine the control the sham animals for the GSM versus the CDMA in same group. And that way they are saving 105 animals there and good 3-hour point there. After coming here and listening to everybody, then I came to realize that, oh, no, maybe they should have had another control group there. But this is after coming here. Now, the thing is, COMET assay and micronucleus assay, these are very short-term studies usually. In genetic toxicology, we dose these animals for COMET assay 2 days, for micronucleus assay 2 days, and sacrifice them either after 2 days of dosing for COMET, for micronucleus on day 4, and we do the assays. And if we are doing combined assay, then we would dose them just 3 days. And on day 3, we do the sacrifice and we do both assays. So here I don't understand. We didn't save any animals because we sacrificed them on day 14. So why did we wait 14 days? Because, as you said, this is just a snapshot in time for COMET assay. So the effect is not cumulative. Whatever you are seeing what you dosed yesterday and today, and that's it. That's what you will see there. And in micronucleus assay also, had it been rat study, you are not going to see any extra effect because of the spleen filtering out the micronuclei. This is a mouse study, and you could. So that's one question I have. And of course, the studies were very well done. You followed the OECD guideline 474 for the micronucleus and 489 for the COMET, although COMET was done before the 489 was written. But the cells were again scored to clarify, and it was very well done there. So one thing, of course, in COMET assay is when we do COMET assay, we will do it in 3-4 organs and say it comes up positive in liver. So we call it positive. We don't say that, oh, it was positive only in liver. We say it's a positive overall COMET assay. So here also we see it positive in frontal cortex. So we should say that this is positive in COMET assay. Initially, I was concerned about the historical data also, because in these studies, historical data take a big part when we are evaluating. However, I do realize that maybe the standard historical data that we have wouldn't have helped much here, because these animals were in different conditions, and it's good that we have concurrent historical data and we are concurrent vehicle or negative control data, and we are using that for comparison. Another point I have is, so normally when we do these assays, the animals are 6 to 8 weeks, at the most up to 10 weeks. Here, mice are 14 weeks old. So, and we are doing these assays later on. I don't know if that would have an effect. We didn't see anything in the micronucleus assay, and maybe age has something to do with it. So those are essentially my comments.
Thank you. Questions from the panel, Ms. Pam? So I have a question that relates to her last comment about the COMET assay and the time frame that it was done. But go ahead and respond, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So.
Well, thank you, Ms. Pond, for your comments. The reason that the animals went for, it was 14 weeks, not 14 days, went for 14 weeks for the micronucleus study is that we routinely integrate micronucleus assessments in our 14-week subchronic studies that we do preceding a chronic study. In this particular case, we had a whole group of animals coming off. They were put on extra with the 2-year animals, and they were all coming off at that 14-week interim for a variety of different things. One of the things was to assess genetic damage in these animals. So it was, for us, it's a fairly standard thing to integrate these so that we don't run independent tests and use additional animals where we can avoid it. But we do see positive results, negative results, equivocal results. The length of time doesn't seem to influence the outcome of the assay. And we do have some short-term studies that we did well in the past where we then followed up with a 13-week study, and we did get similar results. So I don't see that as a confounding factor there in terms of the results. You also, the overall call, the mention of the overall call. The overall call for the COMET assay is positive. It's positive in males, it's positive in females. But we do, since we looked at multiple tissues, we do indicate where we saw that particular response, but it doesn't diminish the overall call for the assay. On an NTP website in our database, it would say COMET assay positive, and then you would get into the details.
So when I said that 14 weeks, see, you used extra animals. It was not an integrated study.
In this particular study, that
exactly.
is true.
That's
yes.
what I meant.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. Because we do that too, integrated studies. Say it's a 28-day study, and we would do COMET, micronucleus, and these days PIG-A, and all these studies are combined. But the same animal is used for everything. So you are reducing the number of animals.
Right, and that's normally what we do. We do fully integrate it. But in this case, I wasn't involved in setting up. I assume that there was a reason for not pulling animals off at various times during that 14-week period.
For ease of the experimentation, we only had the one time point for the 14 weeks and the other time point for the 2 years at the end of the study.
So the question I had to follow on this comment was, when you gave your nice presentation about showing how the COMET assay is done, you showed what I would consider a somewhat quantitative measure of degree of change in the COMET, from very marginal to the hedgehog. But when you make the call, it's a yes or no. So is it informative to look at the tissues or the assays where they were positive and comment on the degree of positivity, so to speak? In other words, if they were just marginal, that might influence your opinions as to the relevance of this versus some very clear responses. And I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I was struck by the semi-quantitative nature that you displayed at percent of tails, and I might have a different opinion about the strength of that association if they were called positive, but just marginal versus here's a really clear response.
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, you're talking about maybe the breadth of response that we saw within a particular tissue and the strength of the response. I think that would be captured in the actual numbers because we generate for each animal, for each cell, we generate a percent tail DNA value. Then for each of those 100 cells, they are combined to provide a percent tail DNA value for the animal. And then the animals are combined within a treatment group to provide that mean value for the treatment group. So the strength of the response is captured kind of all the way along the way in terms of how we analyze the data. Am I not understanding?
But if you had 100 assays and some percentage of them were positive, and within those that were positive, some were 80%, 90% tail, and some were 10% tail. To me, that would make a difference in the strength of that assay, even though you're calling each cell positive or negative based on there. You're not making so it's just a question of whether there are very clear positive responses versus equivocal positive responses that could be discerned across the number of animals or the number of cells that are measured in an animal. And I'm not sure that you can do that with this.
Does the statistics help at all? Is any of that captured in the statistics? I don't think so. I mean, the only thing I can think of to grade the strength of response would be the p-value that's applied to the response that's seen over the dose range or for an individual treatment group. I mean, we have cases in a micronucleus assay where we have what we would consider whoppingly positive responses, and then other cases where we have a clear positive response, but it's markedly less elevated than it would have been in another response.
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at, I guess. It's just a question of the sort of the strength of the observation where you have a positive and whether there's any way to provide any further discussion on the strength of that response. If you saw, versus just the number, because right now it's yes or no when you're done with everything. And I'm just asking if there's more biologically relevant information that is discernible from any of these things having to do with that strength. But this is not my area, so I don't know.
Okay.
Come on.
The thing is, sometimes it depends on what your negative control is giving you. According to that, what you are getting in your dosed animals. Your negative control is, for instance, only 0.5, and your dosed animal is 10. That's almost huge, 20-fold increase. Whereas there are times when your vehicle control or negative control is 5, and here you have 10. That's only 2-fold. But to me, both are positive. Both are clearly positive, and your p-value is less than 0.05, and you call them both positive.
Any other staff have any other response to? Okay, thank you. Okay, we will move on. I think we are now down to Dr. Malice, correct? Yes, Dr. Malice.
Hi, Tyler Malice. So I'd like to start off by saying I think the study has been extremely well done. I think it's extremely thorough. And from a data perspective, which is my specialty, it accommodates for a lot of effects that I was very happy to see. In terms of how the mice and the rats were exposed to radiation, the fact that everything was normalized to aim for the same absorption rate on the tissue level was very impressive. And I think that as it's presented, if you can state that that was the goal of your exposure system up front and very clearly, I think that that can really help drive the point home and drive the importance of all the work that went into the exposure system. I know that there was some debate among reviewers as presentations occurred as to what the specifics of the exposure were, talking about, well, did a larger mouse receive more radiation than a smaller mouse, etc. And I think that's an extremely big point in your study, and I'd really like to see that emphasized. The specific absorption rate is tissue-based. From the statistics side of things, it's great to see that so much care was taken from the test chosen for all the very many different traits that were assessed throughout the study. Recently in the literature, it's come to the forefront that litter effect, basically mice from the same dame, pups from the same dame, can be more closely related than pups from different dames. And it was very nice to see that addressed in the technical report. In addition, it was nice to see that a small number of litter mates were chosen as they were partitioned to their respective sampling groups. Again, if you take many pups from the same litter, even if you accommodate for it statistically, you still lose power to detect the effect. One point that I think should be added to the technical report that Dr. Shockley and Dr. Cochran already touched on is that control of the type 1 error rate. When I first read the report, I thought, you know, why is there no controlling for multiple hypothesis testing? There's hundreds of statistical tests done, and while in individual tests or individual tables there is a control for the multiple hypothesis testing issue, why is there not a global control? We see global controls with gene expression data, we see it in any omics field, and then high throughput screening. The fact that Dr. Shockley then explained, hey, we pull in additional evidence, this actually allows us to maintain a higher level of sensitivity in our analysis while still preserving control of the type 1 error rate. I think that's something that's very important to mention explicitly. And the fact that as NTP you can say, with this multiple evidence source system, we're obtaining an overall type 1 error control rate of 0.05 to 0.07, that's very good, and that's a big positive that I think should be added to the technical report. In line with that, I know we've discussed the appropriateness of including historical controls. I'm a fan of including the historical controls. I think it gives you another point of reference to help assess the validity of any given statistical observation that you have. I manage a group of statisticians that actually provides service to a subcampus of NCI. And we discuss this all the time where people want a p-value. Those p-values have meanings and constraints, and there's assumptions with the models that have to be paired to the underlying biology. And so the more you can address those issues, the more those p-values that are created will help reflect the underlying biology and will help move on to success in later phases of screens. So more or less, that was my big point. Please include the multiple hypothesis testing correction. Then I also had a little bit of a point as NTP moves to design future studies. Everything is becoming progressively more data-driven. And so when you design a study and you see, hey, I'm expecting relatively weak effects. They're going to be statistically marginally significant. Maybe they'll be statistically significant but not robust to multiple hypothesis testing correction. One of the things that I would encourage is as you develop your plan, think about what you're going to do if you encounter a result like that. Think about if at 14 weeks we have an observation and we can say, hey, I see statistical significance here. It's not blowing me out of the water. While my study is still ongoing, while I still have staff, while I still have equipment, is there a way to incorporate replication? Is there a way to bring in additional evidence to either strengthen that finding or say, hey, we don't necessarily need to keep talking about this, we already checked it out. And that's just my one plug as we move more and more into data-driven decision making.
Thank you. Any questions from the panel? Dr. Malice? Dr. Shaw, do you have any response?
Well, thank you for those comments. I think you made some comments about explaining some of the type 1 error rates or the issue of multiple test correction, that maybe we should do a better job in putting that into the TR, that we are taking that into account, and that will not be an issue here. I think you may have, you also, you seem to agree with the way the rat study, I guess in particular, where we're taking litter into account. You did touch on that. And I think you may have alluded to maybe talking more about statistical power. I'm trying to figure out if that's...
I didn't mention too much talking about statistical power. I mean, I could comment on the, hey, could you do a better control in design? Can you look into power calculations? Can you add a margin to make that power calculation turn into a real result? One thing I had forgotten to mention, there was a graph shown earlier today where it showed survival analysis. And you had, I believe, mice today that were not exposed to radiation actually experiencing worse overall survival than I think one group of mice that were exposed to some mid-level of radiation. And then I think tomorrow with the rats, we'll actually see graphs where rats that were not exposed to any radiation, especially male rats, had much worse survivability than their counterparts that were exposed to radiation. And I think this, when I read through a set of results, this pops out to me. And I say, hey, you know, they've assigned equivocal evidence to a few more tumors found in this group than that group. Yet here I see the survivability of a whole population less than the treated group. And I think there was even supporting evidence where lesions in hearts were assessed, and there were more lesions in the control group or something like that, some specific. And I think that it's also important to address those findings and at least mention them. And if you have reasons that they're not valid, I think those are worth discussing, right? Because as I sit here right now, I think that survival curve has as much weight behind it as some of the equivocal findings today. There might be more evidence. I just think that's something you could touch on. I don't know how closely that fits with the goals of your report, but that's something that popped out to me.
Other staff comments? Okay, if not, we are going to take a short break now. It's about 2:50 now, so we'll return at a quarter after. Yeah, thank you. Okay, a little bit of procedure here. So, yesterday we heard from Panel 1. Panel 1 is reviewing the technical aspects of the exposure facility and the exposure process. Today was the first part of the biology response with the mouse bioassays. What we will do in this discussion, at the end of this discussion, is Panel 2 members will vote yay or nay on a set of statements that will be put on the board. Panel 1 members will not vote, but they are here to answer questions that Panel 2 members may have that relate back to dosing and exposure conditions, etc. In listening to the far-ranging discussions that we've had today, I think a couple of things become evident that need to be the point of further discussion. The first is that there was overall pretty much widespread praise for the basic effort and the basic design of the studies and everything that went into this, and I don't think there's a lot of controversy about whether this was a valid bioassay study. I think there seemed to be agreement on that. The issue of historical controls and how historical controls are used. Are they used on just an informative basis? Are they used statistically to make a decision? Exactly how they are used, I think, requires a little bit more discussion because they were used in certain ways in the report, and that's what we will be looking at. okay, in terms of a vote for each of the outcomes for which classification of carcinogenicity is based. The other issue I think that came up has to do with the issue of the nature of the dose-response relationship, because we clearly saw some instances where there was what appeared to be a strong response at the lower doses and no response at higher doses, and I think we need to address that. So I would put it now to panel 2 members. If there are any issues or people who would like to start off and lead part of a discussion on any of these topics, if there's dead silence when I do that, what we will do is come back and follow the procedures of the NTP in this, which is that I will call for a motion to accept the recommendations as written in the report, which will be on the slide. In total, all of them lumped together. And all of the panel members had this little thing on their sheet, and they indicated that. If there is a motion made, and if it's seconded, we will then take a vote. If no motion is made, or for in total, or a motion is made but there's no second, or if a motion is made and there is a second and we vote, if we vote majority vote, then we've accepted the conclusions, the classification conclusions as they were stated in the document with no further revisions. If you don't agree with that, then we will have and go back and discuss each one individually, which is the way that it will proceed. Just one moment. And so that is where that is how we will follow. Okay, and I will open it up for discussion in just a moment. I just wanted to lay out kind of the process of where we will go for here and how we get to the vote. As the chair, I don't have to vote. I don't get to vote unless there's a tie, and I'm really confident you won't put me in that position. So just so we understand the lay of the land. And now, before we start the general discussion, I did promise you an opportunity to make a comment. So. Yeah, could you use the microphone, please? Dr. Harrell.
I have a few remarks. The first point is following Dr. Barnes' comment about the inverse dose. And I believe that since the intent of this project was essentially to determine whether this radiation does something or not, it would be allowable to lump together all exposures at various times, and it would be allowable to lump GSM and TDMA together as well, so that we see whether this gives us the certainty that we require. The second thing is that I do not think it's acceptable that in your chambers you do not have any ELF magnetic field measurements, because this is a real confounder in your data. Perhaps you can recuperate this by doing measurements now. The other thing is that it's from Dr. Lin's comment, your rats came from somewhere. So it may be worthwhile to go back and learn where these rats came from, what their exposures were, for how long before they were brought to the facility for experimentation. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Harkema.
I have just clarification on is there a single vote on the weight of evidence for the whether it's equivocal
Yes.
or are we talking about several votes? It's just one, right?
Well, initially just one. Okay, and if initially the call will be for in total, which is all of them. That, in other words, you agree with what is already in the report. You've all read the draft report. They made recommendations as to the classification for each of the six outcomes, right? Four outcomes. Yeah, but there were a couple of different endpoints. Okay. And the in total would just be that you agree with everything the way it's been written. And if that's not approved by the committee, then we go back and we take them one by one.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so if you have concerns, if a motion is made to do in total, and you have concerns about those and you don't agree with all of the things that are then you would vote against that. Does that make sense? and then we would come back and do them individually.
Yeah, I think so.
Dr. Wolf?
I was just going to say, individually can be GSM, males, females together, CDMA, males, females together, or it can be broken up, GSM, male, GSM, female. It's whatever the panel so chooses.
Could we put up the in total?
Could I raise a point of clarification?
Go ahead, yes.
Okay. I would like to actually understand how this division made who is to vote, who is not to vote.
That was made when this panel was set up.
So
that's been from the very beginning.
Yeah, the initial panel 1 was requested to look at the adequacy of the exposure system. Panel 2 is evaluating the biology and the calls for the study.
So how would, say, take the panel 2 as an example, making the decision, what criteria would you want the panel 2 members to use as criteria for making any decision?
The information that's been presented, the discussions from the first day, your service as a resource for helping understand issues related to dose and exposure, and then the biological interpretation that the panel brings to the table.
So regardless of the limitations of one's understanding, one group will not be given the privilege to say anything. Another group, regardless, still has the privilege to do so.
Thanks for bringing that up. The way this has been presented right now looks like we're trying to shut off discussion, and in fact that is absolutely not the case at all. We're simply trying to organize the discussion so that you understand how we can walk through these conclusions and yet give you the opportunity to have the discussion, and particularly on those points related to the historical control and the expectation of dose response, because those are things I think as a program, we'd like to hear your thoughts on.
So before I call for this motion, again, I wanted to open the floor for more additional general discussion for clarification of anything that's been presented. If any of the panel 2 members have questions going back to the exposures and the exposure metrics and any of the things that were discussed yesterday, this is the time to answer those. But the ultimate goal here in terms of this discussion now is to end up at the end of this day to have an agreement on the panel as to what the specific conclusions are for categories. But before we get there, again, this is a chance to improve, provide feedback to the NPT staff on any issues that you come up that you think are still unclear, or that you have questions for, or areas where you think the report could be strengthened outside of just these final conclusions. But ultimately, we are to get to these final conclusions today. Dr. Feld.
So a procedural question. So first, if somebody makes a motion and it's seconded, is there an opportunity to make a motion to amend it so that people know that they don't have to vote on just one thing without having further discussion? Like, how does that work?
There's an opportunity, first of all, to discuss a motion after it's been seconded. There's also an opportunity to amend a motion. However, one can also, you can get through that through several mechanisms. You can vote it down and then have a new motion, or you can try to amend the motion. It's usually easier just to vote it down and then
take them one by one then. Okay. Dr. Wolf, did you want to explain or just say where we're at here?
So this is the, in bulleted format, these are the draft NTP conclusions from the technical report on radiofrequency radiation studies in mice. And the GSM modulation conclusions are at the top, and the CDMA modulation conclusions start in the middle of the page. And we, even though it was presented on, we split the non-neoplastic to be specific for that modulation, that statement.
Okay.
And it's males and then females.
These are the things that we'll ultimately be voting on. But again, before we get there, I want to make sure that we have additional discussion. Dr. Klein, yes?
I just want to make a comment on non-linear dose response curves. You know, in the classical tox path setting, the drop in incidence at a higher dose usually indicates mortality, but that's not always the case. And in just two examples that I've been turning over in my head is ionizing radiation, for example, in the A-bomb survivor cohort. You know, it had and post radiation therapy survivor cohorts. For most tissues, it's linear, but for some, it's not. There's a combined cell killing and cell mutation-inducing effect, such that for thyroid, for example, the dose response curve is an inverse U. Also, in a field where I've got a lot of experience with xenoestrogens, the dose response curve is often an inverted U, so that the higher the dose goes, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to go up the higher the dose goes. So we don't know the mechanism for the radiofrequency radiation effect or lack at a given dose, but I think we should consider that linearity is not always the case.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, so when we go through these, I think it would be really helpful if the NTP people could, in each case, say, okay, I know it's based on weight of evidence, but these were the factors. There was lack of a dose response or historical control or something. I know we heard it, but I'm sorry, I can't remember, you know, which ones for each one of these. I mean, I've made up my mind, but I would like to hear that again about just a summary, real quick. These were, or just list it in non-priority, but these were the factors that we came to this conclusion. Is that okay?
Yeah, and that's fine. What I would like to do is say, let's do that when we get to the point where we're discussing these individual outcomes, which will be shortly. Okay. I just want to make sure that there are other issues. For example, we just had a comment from Dr. Klein on nonlinear dose responses, and I'm interested now in any additional discussion on either that topic or anything else we've talked about here, especially concurrent versus historical controls and making judgments. I saw a few hands here. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to follow up on the discussion around the skin fibrosarcomas, and so there was a comment made about challenging.
Can you put your mic a little closer?
Yeah. About challenging the classification, and you said you would take it under consideration. So in the context of if NTP is going to change their classification based on the feedback, how do we understand where their current thinking is on that?
So, I'm not sure if...
Are you referring to, this chat box, I'm referring to the actual, the naming of the lesion versus?
No, the classification of equivocal versus some evidence.
Oh, no, we're not, our recommendation is equivocal evidence.
So these are NTP's draft.
These are the ones that we have come to and asking you all to review.
Are you using your
comments around the challenge around making that summit, you would take it under advisement. So that's what I'm trying to understand is if the comments you have heard here are changing your opinion on things, how do we know where you're going with that?
And I think the comment that I had made before was that we would add some language into the report that would distinguish, I think it was Dr. Harkema that had an issue with understanding the difference between equivocal and some. Like Dr. Blystone said, these are the final conclusions that we've come to and that we're presenting to you.
The definitions of equivocal are set by the NTP, and that we're not going to change those here. Though that would require.
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
I
It's
think
how you put things into your classifications that are defined.
So currently what we'll be looking for you is whether or not you recommend that these are the final conclusions or whether you recommend based on your evaluation of the evidence a different classification for males or females for either of the modulations.
A different classification within the existing NTP definition.
That's
Yes.
correct.
Thank you. Dr. Feldman? Oh. Go ahead, Dr. Feldman.
Chair rules. So this is a question, I guess, for a pathologist in terms of really understanding the relationship between the hepatoblastoma and the adenomas and carcinomas, and whether you consider them to be on a continuum. And I know that this has been a tumor type that's been changing over the years. So any additional perspective on that?
Amy Bricks. So when we look at the liver tumors, the hepatocellular tumors, we will look at them individually as well as combined. And we know that the hepatocellular adenomas and carcinomas, derive from the same cell type. And the hepatoblastomas very frequently arise within a hepatocellular adenoma or carcinoma. And the cell of origin hasn't been 100% pinned down, but we think it's a primitive cell that can either develop hepatocytes or oval cells, bile duct cells. So there is some reason for including them together. But on the other hand, we also evaluate them statistically, biologically, toxicologically, independently as well.
Dr. Jones?
Lydia Andrews-Jones. Just on the comment, and thank you, Dr. Klein, for your comment on the nonlinear dose response, especially that has been seen with at least ionizing radiation. And when I look at this, if we consider the possibility that this is a nonlinear dose response, at least in the mice, I think that may change somewhat of the interpretation, specifically of the malignant fibrous histiocytomas, but there's also, that brings some other tumors that maybe should at least, like the hibernomas that were mentioned previously, and there's also pituitary adenomas and one carcinoma in the male mice, and I think that was, I can't remember if it's GSM or CDMA, but one of the two, that perhaps at least should rise to mention in the equivocal part, if the consideration for a nonlinear dose response, because those did occur in the mid-dose group. And I don't know if there'd be, people would like to make some further discussion of that.
Comments? Dr. Barnes?
I just repeat, the data we have shows clearly very nonlinear effects where we see both acceleration and inhibition of cancer cell growth in cell culture dishes. So we have very clear nonlinear response as a function of amplitude, both static fields and at 60 cycles. And there's some data, but not as complete at RF. So I just comment that that data exists and it's not all published yet.
Thank you. I have a question of clarification on procedure that is raised by Dr. Andrews-Jones's question, which is, if there are findings, for example, certain types of tumors that were mentioned in the report, but did not find their way into any of the conclusions, what is the process for elevating them to a conclusion?
Well, that would be, a motion would be made usually on one of these conclusions. And if in male mice there was an additional tumor type that was considered by someone on the panel to be elevated to that equivocal level or some or clear, then that would be you'd either vote this one down and make that as a separate motion, or request to amend the motion and then have a discussion of that particular tumor type.
That makes sense. Thank you. So are there any other comments that people would like to make in general, or questions to the NTP staff or to panel one members before we move on to calling the vote for overall or total? Dr. Adler?
So I guess what I'm potentially witnessing here is a bit of a paradigm shift. NTP typically looks at chemicals and assumes linearity in the dose response, and what we're seeing here is an example where nonlinearity is changing thinking, and I don't know enough about statistics. I love statisticians, but I hate what you do because I don't understand it at all. And that's why I love you guys, because you explain it. Is there a different statistical analysis that's necessary for nonlinear response?
So I would say that, we have both the pairwise comparisons and the trend tests, and in those cases where there's nonlinearity, the pairwise comparisons that you've seen, some of these are statistically significant. I would say we don't always assume linearity of response in chemical-related findings. Clearly, with endocrine tumors and other endocrine-related things, we often can see compensatory things going on that might generate nonlinearity. So that's always a possibility. It kind of depends on where you're coming into this RFR from the standpoint of expectation. And you've just heard from the RFR experts that maybe this isn't the linearity may not be the thing that it should drive this response.
So thanks. So just quick follow-up. So obviously you've seen endocrine disruptors which don't have the standard linearity. Do the NTP criteria for clear evidence, some evidence, equivocal, where trends and statistical significance with dose response, does that paradigm still hold up in those examples where you have a nonlinear response to a chemical?
So I would say that these are not necessarily designed to address nonlinearity, and it depends on the amount of other factors that are coming into play. So if it's just an effect at a low dose, if we can see other effects that would suggest nonlinearity, it's getting late in the day for me, then this may play a role and suggest that we have an effect at a lower dose. But I just want to balance this across some of the other comments that were made where we really want to make an attempt to reduce the amount of type 1 error where we're calling a lot of false positives, because if we just rely on the statistics, we are going to be making a lot more calls, and that we kind of balance that with the other factors that are going on.
Dr. Barnes?
I would just add that in addition to experimental data, we have at least two different theoretical approaches that could lead to the kind of nonlinear response that we've seen. One in change of recombination of radical pairs, and the other one in terms of feedback with delay. So there is more than just some experimental evidence which you might write out as statistical variation. There is both rather solid data in the cases we have measured, which are not been presented here, where we don't have a very large statistical variation in the data we have at the points where we're observing nonlinearity. So there's more to the nonlinearity than just we happen to see this kind of variation in a set of experimental data. There's both theory and experimental data that at least is partially compatible with each other.
So I would recommend we move forward from our general discussion now, and I would call for a motion to accept the recommendations in total as they are written in the draft report that you all looked at, and it was on the pages that the reviewers were sent to. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second? Okay, with no second, the motion does not go forward. So now I would move to recommend that we move to individual conclusions. And before we launch into individual ones, I would like some sense as to whether people would like to take these each individually by modulation and sex, or whether we can combine modulations, for example, or sex. I'm not sure which best way. My guess is, from where we've been, that we probably need to do each one of them separately, but I would put that to the committee. Is that an agreement that we will just go through these individually? Okay? And I think it's going to be the more straightforward way to move forward. And anticipating that, we have them individually here. So So the way we will do this is I'll call for a motion to approve as this is written on the screen. Okay, and if there is a motion to that and it's seconded and we vote, what we will do then is we will vote, and anybody who votes no will then have the opportunity to say what they would like changed or why they're voting no. And it might be no because I want to add another tumor here, or no because I don't, I disagree with this tumor, but I agree with that tumor, and we can have clarification. So what we will end up doing is essentially wordsmithing these on the screen to a point where we agree. So it's important that people look at exactly what the wording is here. Now, as we do this, it might be useful, and Michael, I don't know if you're prepared or ready to try to give a Cliff Notes version of the rationale for why the NTP staff put these in these categories, but I'm going to ask you to do that to the best of your ability before we launch in. And so what we will do is he will provide a brief overview of the basis for this, then I'll call for the motion, and then we will discuss. Okay?
All right, sounds good. So I'll start with the combined incidence of the fibrosarcoma, sarcoma, and malignant fibrous histiocytoma of the skin. So this lesion, the incidences at the 5 and 10 watts per kilogram exceeded the concurrent control. There was not statistically significant an increase, but however, these were outside the range of the historical control in both of these groups. One of the reasons that we did not advance this to some evidence was due to the fact that there was no statistical significance. It didn't metastasize, and there was no SAR dependent increase in the response. We saw that it was flat at the 5 and 10 watt per kilogram exposures. As far as, you want me to go to the next one too, or you want to take them individually?
Well, let's see. So that's the first bullet there under the male B6F3-1 mice.
So if you happen to have your technical report in front of you, it's on page 79, and the incidences are 1, 1, 5, 4.
Are there questions from the committee to the NTP staff for any clarifications on that?
Lydia Andrews-Jones, there are also, I wanted to point out in the CDMA males, there's 1 at the low dose and 2 at the mid dose.
Okay, thank you.
So we did look at the incidences in the CDMAs and in the females, and we just didn't feel like the incidences in those rose to the level of even equivocal evidence.
So could I, Dr. Runke?
Yeah, I think, Amy, you explained it quite well with the pigments and all that. It was not so aggressively looking, these tumors in the tails, so that convinced me to stay for the equivocal, even though I have a little feeling that the number is quite high. But knowing that any injury on the skin, in especially male mice, might lead to some kind of reactions, this gives just the reason for saying, okay, it's equivocal. It still says there might be something.
I would support this.
Oops, Dr. Hoffman.
So, yeah. I would support this opinion because that sounds for me very plausible. I think there are not enough evidence for the.
So thank you. So to move this forward, would one of you like to make that into a motion?
For me, this is the problem that I do not really understand this process with motions, and I'm emotional. Yeah. But
Well, what we're trying to do is just have a pathway to clarity and agreement on what the wording is in the document. And so by saying, you move to adopt the language for equivalent evidence of carcinogenic activity for fibrosarcoma, sarcoma, malignant fibrosis, blah, blah, blah.
But I'm fine with it.
Then you just made the motion.
Okay.
Do I hear a second? Okay, we have a second. All in favor, please raise your hand. Opposed? Okay, for those that are opposed, and that's perfectly fine. Now we have the opportunity to say.
Can I make sure I have the right?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Please hold your hands up again if you're
So
voted no.
Dr. Adler and Dr. Felter voted no, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, and, okay.
So now I need each of you to just say why it's no, and what would be very helpful is what change in language here would be appropriate to you that would make that acceptable. And then we'd have to reword this and vote again.
No,
No?
we have an 8-3 vote, so the motion carries.
Yeah.
And their no just is explaining for the record why they voted no.
Oh, okay, it's for the
Because
record.
it's a majority rules.
Got it. Okay. Okay, it's a majority. So,
Excuse
but
me?
what we need the explanation for the record as
Yes.
to why it is. Right.
How many total votes are you expecting?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And it was 8-3, if I counted correctly.
That's
Did I count
correct.
correctly? Yes.
Okay, so now for the record, Dr. Jones.
I voted no because of just the sheer number of these tumors when there's so few in the historical database. And I think that tends to bring it, it's a very gray borderline between equivocal and some evidence. And taking into consideration the weight of the evidence and the exposure greatest to those two areas where these tumors are occurring, plus the number of tumors that we are seeing, I feel like I come down on the other side of the fence on the some evidence side.
Thank you. Dr. Felton?
So, Susan Felter, my reasoning is very much the same, and I will just say that when the information that we had to evaluate in the bioassay showed that there was only one historical control out of 589 or so, and it happened to come from this study, meaning that there were none in many other hundreds of animals. Now, my understanding is that you're saying that that there is another one, but that's not what's in the report.
Can you use the microphone, please, Chad?
I'm sorry, I believe at the footnotes B, the 2 out of 589. So it's not a huge difference, but.
So I'm looking at table A3A.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was an error that was picked up in our audit. But if you look at the table on page 79, the correct number appears on page 79 in that table.
Well, and I know you said that, but I didn't realize it was an error here. I thought it had to do with whether you went back past 5 years.
No, that was just an error that appeared in here. But like I said, if you turn to page 79, that number is there.
Okay, all right, I appreciate that clarification. I still come out in the same place overall, but I agree it's a very gray area.
Thank you. Dr. Adler?
My reasoning is similar. Exceeding historical control by this amount stands out to me. If this was a pharmaceutical running through a carcinogenicity assay, I could not call this equivocal and get away with it.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a second part of this exposure of the GSM modulation whoa.
Sorry.
We need to do the alveolar bronchial adenoma
I'm sorry.
carcinoma, right?
That was my mistake. I thought it was, okay.
Yeah, so that topic is open for discussion, and if there are, I'm going to change the way I did this a little better, hopefully, so that we have some clear discussion about perspectives before we vote. So if there are people that have concerns about including alveolar, bronchiolar adenoma, and carcinoma combined of the lung as equivocal, it would be helpful to hear your concerns you have on that. If there are no concerns, then all we need is a motion to adopt the language equivocal evidence of carcinogenic activity for alveolar, bronchiolar adenoma, carcinoma combined in the lung.
I move.
Second? Moved and seconded. All in favor, please raise your hand. Opposed? None opposed? Okay, thank you.
So the motion carried unanimously, correct?
Motion carried unanimous.
Sorry, I forgot to put the, give me just 1 minute.
Dr. Corcoran? Yeah.
Dr. Corcoran, Dr. Eden, did you want to offer an opportunity to add other lesions, statements under this group of animals and exposure, RFR?
Yeah, yes, actually.
Or call for it, and if there's none, there can be that stated for the record.
That's a good point. If there are, so if we go back to that previous one, we have these there, and now what we could do is if there are people who would like to include another tumor that was not listed here on this list of equivocal evidence of carcinogenic activity in male mice under GSM modulation, please indicate so now and we can discuss that. And if there are no offers, then this stands as written. Any additions?
Were the hibernomas in the GSM or the CDMA?
Amy Bricks, they were in the GSM males.
I'd like to at least discuss including those hibernomas. You know, the brown fat is and has some endocrine properties, and I think there's several at this mid dose that have some endocrine properties that possibly could be considered in a nonlinear dose response. And I just wanted, and I don't think it definitely doesn't go up to the some evidence, but perhaps it should be included in the equivocal. And I just want to hear what some other people might say.
Dr. Wyde, could you summarize briefly what the numbers were on that in terms of how many animals in these groups?
Yeah, for the hibernomas, there were only 2 that occurred in the 5 watt per kilogram exposure. So in the mid-dose group, that was 2. There was none in any of the other exposures or the controls.
And for what it's worth, historical controls, is this a rare tumor or is...
There were none in the historical controls.
Thoughts? Dr. Harkema?
So, I know this was not designed for mechanisms or anything else, but there was a lot of discussion about SAR and fat. And what was the SAR again in fat? Maybe I can...
It was very low, if I recall. The fat was one of the lowest of all of the categories, but is that correct?
Well, brown fat versus, I don't think they can distinguish brown from white, but in general, I would just put that out there, that there's, that was low.
But we shouldn't be careful. SAR is just one of the metrics.
Then if we look at the induced E field, which the field the cell sees, these are much more similar than the SAR, because it's related to the conductivity of the tissue. So if you would take E field as a metric, it would be quite similar to between the tissues.
Okay, good, thanks.
That's fine.
Amy, do you know where they were located?
I don't know for sure. I think at one point I looked them up, and I don't think that they were just located between the scapula, which I was expecting. I think they were mediastinal. Excuse me, mesenteric.
And again, these were in the low dose, the two that we're seeing were in the low dose or the mid dose group. So from this discussion, would anyone like to make a motion to add that tumor to this list of equivocal evidence of carcinogenic activity?
I'd like to make a comment for the discussions that is being taking place and the votes that's taking place now. Wouldn't it be instructive, informative to actually have those tumor incidences flashed on the screen so everybody can see it rather than asking a question, do you recall where it is and so forth like that. You are relying on people's recollection to make a decision. I think it's much better to do it on the basis of quantitative information that you can provide, and there is. And you are trying to vote on the basis of a quantitative set of data. But on the other hand, you're essentially relying on people's recollection.
I appreciate that. That's why we're asking the staff to review what the evidence is. And I
think it would be good to have them projected on the screen.
I don't know how easy that is to do at this point in time. Most people have the report in front of them, but not everyone does. So, Dr. Adler, comment?
Well, I agree with Dr. Lin. For tomorrow, for the rat study, I think it would be helpful if we could do this. Obviously, it's short notice to prepare this now, but for tomorrow.
Right, and so I think at this point we have the report, and I think you raise a very legitimate point in terms of having it in your mind. But for the rest of these, the numbers of tumors are not large as we go through here, so I think we can review these as we go.
Yeah, philosophically, actually, I have another concern about the whole process. And early on, there was discussion whether there is any linear dependence or nonlinear dependence, and the impression listening what's been talked about was for sure the study was designed on the assumption that if there's a response, it's going to be a linear response. Now, anything else that's going to be counter to that, therefore there will be a lot of reluctance to actually accept anything other than linear. So I think philosophically there is something that need to be considered in this decision-making process.
Well, I'm not sure I agree that the designs were assuming a linear response. They did both trend tests as well as individual tests. And if the individual tests were significant and the trend test was not, it was still considered. Is that correct, Dr. Buber?
Actually, in a couple of cases, actually, the pairwise test that shows something different from the dose response test.
Yes, that's correct. So I will ask again if there is I already forgotten. Did you make the motion? You did make. You made the motion, and the tumor was the brown fat tumor. Is there a second for that?
That was what I was pointing out, that we have a number of uncommon tumors. That was not only the hibernoma, it was also the teratomas in the female mid-dose group, and the occurrence of pituitary tumor in the CDMA. So there could be, it could be raised to equivocal uncommon due to uncommon entities.
So I would like to know what, we need to be a little more specific than uncommon tumors in terms of what specific other ones and what those incidents were, if that's possible to pull up.
So we're looking at the teratoma. Is that the first one? The ovarian teratomas were 0 in controls, 0 in 2.5, 2 at 5 watts per kilogram, and 1 at the high dose of 10 watts per kilogram.
Is that one that you would like added?
I think it would be worth.
Other rare tumors or other tumors?
Well, as Lydia said, the hibernoma.
Yeah, we've got that. Dr. Feld.
And also the pituitary tumors in that's in the CDMA males at the 5 watt per kilogram.
Yeah.
This is
Amy
GSM.
Bricks. I'd just like to point out that the only one of these that's in the GSM male that we're discussing is the hibernoma, so perhaps.
Okay, that's important.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we need to make sure that we're on the right thing. So it's just that one tumor then, and the other ones were not in this group. Okay, thank you. So we have a motion to add hybridomas to the male equivocal evidence category. Is there a second? Okay, if there is no second, then that will not be added. Dr. Felton? Question, yes.
So the one thing I struggle with when we are looking at tumor incidences that are increased at one time point in one group, I'm wanting to think about biological plausibility, what we know about the whole data set that we're looking at, because there are also incidences where we see them in controls and not in any dose groups. Are we going to have a discussion around whether they're protected? So it's just a caution that when I was being facetious, I was not being serious. But at the same time, I think it should be recognized that if you go through the data and you go through every single endpoint, you will find some that there are none in the treated animals, and you see them in the controls. So,
that's a very legitimate point. I think that we have to recognize what the difference between equivocal evidence and no evidence or insufficient evidence to reach equivocal, because equivocal is lower than some. Okay, and that's a judgment call for sure. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
We appreciate your diligence in looking at this data that way, because that's what we like for you to do. And just I wanted to point out that a vote for equivocal does not exclude linear or nonlinear response, because it's still about a possibility. So you're not voting for or against that.
Okay, so the next group we have then. Sorry, the next group.
Yeah, I'm getting there.
So now we're at female B6C3F1 mice. Equivocal category is the incidence of malignant lymphoma. And so I would like to open this for discussion. Could I have some clarification in terms of what the incidence was? Thank you.
Sure. So for the malignant lymphoma in GSM females, the incidence is 2, 13, which was statistically significant, 9, which was statistically significant, and 6 at the high dose. Our decision for equivocal evidence was based on the fact that all exposed groups were higher than in the controls, that there was pairwise significance at the 2.5 and 5 watt per kilogram exposures, and that it was seen in both modulations. However, it didn't rise to the level of some evidence because there was no SAR-dependent increase in the response. The control group, in this case, obviously, as we discussed, was very much below the historical controls, which ranged from 10 to 36 when you don't include the concurrent controls.
Thank you.
And all the exposed groups were similar within the historical control range, even the ones that were statistically significant.
Thank you. And we've had a lot of discussion earlier about the challenges of this interpretation given the extraordinarily low rate in the controls, and that's countered by a historically highly variable incidence that ranges a lot, although this is at the low end of what has ever been seen before. There's been, I think, very legitimate discussion about the fact that in this particular instance, historical controls could have questionable value because of the nature of the background exposures being very different in this group of animals compared to historical controls because of the potential shielding of the aging and stuff. This is reflection of discussion that I recall. Dr. Harkema?
Just one thing you said that I'm not quite sure if it's correct, that it's never been seen before, because I think the range, there was a range in there somewhere in the mice. I thought I saw 2%.
That was the study.
Yeah, for this study it was.
Oh, that was just this study.
Yeah, this study was 2%.
And so was it 10% or 10%?
So the mean is 16% when you look at the other studies.
Right.
When you exclude the current study that there's 2%, the next lowest is 10%.
10%. Okay, good. Thanks. Sorry.
That was what I recalled as being strikingly lower than the others, and that's that does raise some issues about, you know, how you compare this number, because these numbers fall within the range of the historical controls, and yet the question of whether that's a legitimate comparison or not because of background issues is a fair point. Other comments? Yes.
I was going to say it'd be really helpful to put that in the report. The difference, the lowest before this was 10%.
Is there any other discussion on this particular tumor in female mice? If not, could I get a motion to approve this category of equivocal evidence for malignant lymphomas in female mice?
I move.
Second?
Me too.
Second. All in favor? Please raise your hand. Opposed? Okay, Dr. Corkin and Dr. Klein are opposed. Dr. Corkin, could you provide your rationale?
Very briefly, I believe the historic controls here, this is a unique case in which historic controls may not be very informative, and the lack of linearity in dose response has been discussed in an ample fashion. And I'd like to know what other drivers the study author considered to be the major driver, bringing it in a balance of a weight of evidence to equivocal. If the linearity and the historic controls are smaller drivers than for other tumors.
And you mean versus some?
Versus some.
Amy Briggs. We didn't see, I mean, all of the incidences in all of the dose groups were similar. They didn't go up. They didn't, make a U-shaped curve. They didn't, they were all within what we would expect in mice. And the problem is they were all increased because they had shared control. So one control group made all of the other occurrences high. And so we didn't see any pattern that was abnormal.
Okay. Was the control group a legitimate control group?
Well, I think that's why it was equivocal. I mean, had the control group been, what we would have expected, we wouldn't have even looked twice at these incidences for a call. So that was the uncertainty in our...
It just gives me a little bit of heartburn. That's why I voted the way I did.
Dr. Klein?
I think for me the strongest factor is the parallel control. Yeah, and if you're going to have a control, you ought to believe the control. So that's why I think the responses at 2.5 watts and 5 watts are probably a real effect. And I also believe statistics, and there's nice p-values there. So that's my basis.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, gotta go up, sorry. I think, Camden, the CDMA is in the same file, right? Lower down or up?
Well, while she's looking for that, let me also ask for female mice. I don't think we had asked the question if there were other tumors that anybody saw that they wanted to raise as potentially equivocal.
Where's the CDMA total? Where's the CDMA total? No, I'm doing CDMA total. Just give me a minute. We reordered the file.
That was the CDM too.
Yeah, I just want CDMA without.
Okay, I think we're...
Hold on, I'm sorry. We're almost there.
It's past the GSMP.
Yeah, okay. Here we go.
Okay, so now we're at male mice again, but looking at CDMA modulation.
Excuse me.
And for this category, under equivocal, we have hepatoblastoma of the liver. And open this for comments or discussion. We've already talked a little bit about this rather rare form of tumor. Let me go back to Dr. Wyde so he can repeat the.
I'll give you the incidences and our thoughts behind this call. So for the hepatoblastoma, we have 6 in control, And in the treated groups, we have 16, which was statistically significant, and 7 at the highest exposure. So the incidences at the low and high dose were similar to the control. We had a statistically significant increase at the 5 watts per kilogram, but there was no SAR-dependent increase, and there was no positive trend. So when you look at these compared to the historical controls, the control in this study was 6.6%, which is at the high end of the historical control incidence, which was 7% in our other studies. So based on this, we call this equivocal evidence.
Thank you. Dr. Felton?
So one of the things that I think would be helpful in considering the overall evidence for the liver, and we've done it for some of the others, but this is the most highly variable tumor type in male mice, right? And the hepatoblastoma in particular has been, 20 years ago you didn't see them very often, and now you see them pretty often, right? So it's been changing quite a bit over the last couple of decades. And I think it's really important to consider the entire spectrum of liver tumors that we're seeing in here, but it's also worth noting that, at least I think it's worth noting, that in the 3 other groups, let's see, I made notes. In the female GSM, the liver is highest in controls. Let's see, the incidence of hepatocellular carcinomas and blastomas were driven almost entirely by the carcinomas, but the incidence was highest in controls and lower in the other dose groups. And for the CDMA females, it was the same thing, where it was highest in the controls. And I think that given the variability, given the number of endpoints we're looking at, with the liver in particular, you have adenomas, carcinomas, adenomas plus carcinomas, blastomas, adenomas plus carcinomas plus and at some point, something's going to pop. This is unusual. It is a very high, weird number, but I'm struggling with biological plausibility that in one modality of one gender that you would see something in a mid-dose group where there's absolutely nothing else in the liver, and it goes away when you look at all the liver tumors combined.
So your question is, why is it equivocal and not?
Right.
No,
right. Yeah, sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I was trying to look at the big picture.
And related to that, what was the range of the historical controls? You gave us the mean.
No, actually, I gave you the high end. The mean was 3%. The range was from 0 to 7%. So the highest was 7%. That's correct. Yes.
Can you want to comment on the choice of putting this as equivocal versus no effect?
This is Amy Briggs, and I think it was just so much higher than the other groups. It was twice, the control, so it was hard to completely ignore. But again, we couldn't be absolutely sure, so that lands us in equivocal
Which is
territory.
What the equivocal category is possible, but not certain at all. Dr. Harkema?
I would agree. I think that's the most conservative approach. And I think you fall into danger if you don't put it into equivocal in this case, because it's so high.
Further discussion? Not, I would call for somebody to make a motion to include in male mice the equivocal evidence hepatoblastoma of the liver.
I'll move.
Motion second. Dr. Adler, thank you. All in favor? Opposed? Dr. Felter, I think you've already given us your explanation.
And I do just want to be clear that a lot of that is driven by looking at all of the liver tumors. If this is originating from an adenoma, and we looked at adenomas and carcinomas and blastomas combined, that was really instrumental in my thinking.
Thank you.
Okay, just 1 minute.
Yeah, okay, so female mice is next for malignant lymphoma. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So before we move on to female, you could keep it there, but are there additional tumors not included in the initial report that anybody would like to raise as potentially being included in the equivocal category?
Lydia Andrews-Jones, I'd like to at least consider the pituitary tumors in the mid-dose group. There were 2 adenomas and 1 carcinoma, which were considered rare.
And Dr. Wyde, was that it for all groups, those 2 tumors, or those 3?
Yeah, there was no other tumors in either the control or either of the other treatment groups. It was just, as Dr. Andrews-Jones said, there was just 2 adenomas at that mid-dose and 1 carcinoma, and that was all that was observed in the study.
And that was the carcinoma was in a different animal than the adenomas, so there were 3 animals total affected. Okay, and historical controls of that type of tumor?
The historical control was 0.
Thank you. Dr. Rinke?
I think at this point we should consider the focal hyperplasias that were described for the pars distalis. And
is that part of the non-neoplastic, or is that?
It is part of the non-neoplastic.
So we will have a different category for the non-neoplastic.
No, but to support whether to take it or not,
okay.
Because there was not so much difference between in the hyperplasias.
Of the pituitary.
Of the pituitary.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Further discussion on this? Dr. Jones, did you want that as a motion to include pituitary adenomas and carcinomas in the male?
Can I say something? Amy Briggs, I just wanted to give you the incidences of the pituitary gland pars distalis hyperplasia in the CDMA males. It was 1, 0, 0, 0.
So there was no hyperplasia in the exposed groups.
1 in the control and none in the treated.
Are we on males or females? I just want for clarification.
Those are males.
Oh, too bad.
Males.
Dr. Jones.
I'll move that we consider it for equivocal. And I also wanted to point out, we haven't begun to discuss the rats, but in the male rats, in both modulations, there is an increase in pituitary tumors that is dose responsive.
Thank you. So we have a motion to include pituitary adenomas and carcinomas in the male mice. Is there a second? Okay, hearing none, that will not be included. Thank you for the discussion. Okay, we will move on now to female mice. So in female mice, we have an incidence of malignant lymphoma, as we discussed with male mice. Dr. Wyde, can you provide us with the numbers there?
Sure. Again, this was the lesion where we had 2% at the control, which was below the historical control rate. We had 9 at the low dose group, which was statistically significant, 6 at the mid, and 7 at the high dose group. Our justification here is the same as what we discussed for the GSM. The only difference that I would point out here between this and the GSM is that the statistical significance in this case was only at the 2.5 watt per kilogram exposure, where GSM was at the 2.5 and 5 watt per kilogram exposures.
Thank you. Any further discussion on this? We've talked quite a bit about these tumors. Is there a motion to include this category as malignant lymphomas in females as equivocal evidence of carcinogenic activity?
I'll move.
Thank you. Second? Dr. Felter seconds. All in favor? Please raise your hand. Opposed? It's unanimous. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think, so we've done males and females, both modulations. We have non-neoplastic that we have to vote on, and I think that we could probably do that in total. Dr. Corcoran, sorry.
Dr. Eaton, do you want to ask for any additional nominations for this species and mode of exposure?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Are there any additional tumors in female mice that you would like to add to this list of equivocal that were not included in the draft NTP report? Okay, seeing none, I would now ask for if there are any clarifications requested from the committee regarding non-neoplastic lesions. Sorry, because there were, as I recall, very few throughout the study.
Excuse me, just for my own clarification, are we talking about GSM and CDMA together? Okay, let me go back up here to the top then. Sorry. No, that's okay. I just want to be sure I don't mess you up. So, this is what we're looking at.
Yeah, so the question is, can we combine those since they didn't change?
Right, we can have them as one vote,
Yeah.
yes. I did just separated them because I wasn't sure how you were going to move through.
Yeah, that's not changing any of the decisions, so I don't see any problem with that. So could I entertain a motion to, in total, accept the report as written for non-neoplastic lesions in male, female mice? Any discussion? Anything, Dr. Wyde, that you would like to bring to the attention of the committee? Do I hear a motion?
Could I ask for clarification? I may not be paying attention, so I did not quite hear. Is the panel going to consider both GSM and CDMA together or not?
Oh, I mean by combining?
Combining them, right.
Well, that's a fair question. We've looked at those individually, and the question is there a reason why one might go back and change a classification by combining them rather than looking at them individually?
It's not necessarily changing, rather than taking a different look at the data. In other words, while CDMA and GSM modulation are different, the carrier frequency are both 1900 megahertz. So there are some commonalities there as well. They are both radio frequency radiation at the same frequency, except the way they were used are slightly different.
Dr. Felter?
So I think that is something that many of us are considering as we think about the overall weight of evidence, and that's something I mentioned when I was looking at the liver tumors in terms of biological plausibility and what did we see with all of the tests. But I think there would be a reason not to combine them for statistical evaluation, but a reason to combine them in terms of overall consideration when it comes to plausibility and weight of evidence, but on a case-by-case basis.
Dr. Booker, you have a comment on how that might be done? Is it
So-
different for this kind of study than other NTP?
So I would actually prefer that the reports be considered as they are, keeping the GSM and CDMA separate, but I'd also entertain a recommendation from the committee that in an overall evaluation in future publications on the comparisons, that this be part of that comparison, that there be a combination. Because one of the things that we had asked be considered on the first day was to try to get a sense of whether from the biological standpoint there was reason to believe that the frequency was more important or that modulation was in fact an important factor that could distinguish these two. And I think I got both answers out of the first day. So,
well, let me supplement that a little bit. First of all, the SAR, or how much radio frequency energy is deposited in the tissue, is governed by the 1900 megahertz, not by the modulation. The modulation itself will change the characteristic of that particular exposure by the nature that they are not modulating at the same same frequency or the same using or the same scheme, but that does not necessarily say they're totally different. They are actually very much the same in the sense that what gets the radio frequency energy deposited into the whole body or the specific organ or a given tissue site is governed actually by 1900 megahertz frequency.
So I think, Dr. Booker, that it would be useful to have some discussion, whether it's in publications that follows, but clearly the whole is perhaps greater than the sum of the parts when you look at.
Is your microphone on?
It is, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So in the study here where we have all these different groups and we have common tumor types across groups, there may be instances where the whole was greater than the sum of the parts in terms of looking at the weight of evidence. And here we are taking them out and looking at females, looking at males, looking at two different modulations. And I think that we don't want to lose the potential biological relevance of looking across all of the categories together. I'm not sure that there's value in reclassifying in that extent, but I think that's a point of discussion that could be present in the document and certainly in publications that would follow.
I think that's an item worthy of further discussion in the sense that clearly I agree that statistics is one thing. As NTP has articulated, weight of evidence actually is more of a topic of consideration in its deliberations. So in that sense, I think it's relevant actually not to defer to the publication stage, but rather do it as it was done for the GSM, CDMA, male or female. Instead of just simply stopping there, I think they ought to be all collected together and look at it as a totality as far as what happens when radio frequency radiation is imposed on these animals.
So a question for Dr. Wyde. Have you in fact done tabulations where you took basically it's pretty much tumor by tumor type where there was an indication of equivocal or some evidence, and then lump them together, say here's how many tumors in both modulations, males and females, for this type of tumor across categories?
We haven't tabulated them together, mostly just in our look to see, just like everybody here has done, to see if there's a similarity between what we're seeing in the response in GSM versus CDMA, to see if there's a similarity in the response. But we didn't tabulate them together.
Okay.
But that is not to say that they cannot be done or that should not be done. It's just simply because it was not done.
Well, I think that's a recommendation that the staff has heard and something that they can certainly take under consideration. I would agree that I think that it is important that there be discussion about the similarities or lack thereof of different tumor types across the modulations as well as across the sex and perhaps even species.
But I would like to remind the panel that the design of the study was based on whole body exposure. That means including all tissues inside the body. Therefore, any tumor that was observed in any of the tissue sites or organs are relevant.
So I will come back now to a call for a motion to accept the conclusions regarding non-neoplastic lesions as written in the technical report. All right, Dr. Adler, second. Dr. Felder, all in favor? Opposed? Okay, that's unanimous. Thank you. So, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's it for this session. We will go through this exercise with lots of interesting discussion tomorrow related to rats, and I appreciate all of the input and the frank and good ranging discussions we've had on all of these outcomes and some very difficult choices. There's no question that a lot of these data are on the fence between one category and the other, and I appreciate people stating what they think is the case. So thank you. We're adjourned for the day. See you tomorrow morning.